So welcome to our Managing Weeds in Grasslands and Rangelands webinar this morning. We're going to be starting right at 9 and continuing through about 12 p.m. I'm your moderator today, and I'll be doing my best to keep us on schedule. So just a few notes before we get started. We are recording the webinar for educational or promotional use. But no one that is an attendee will be showing up on the screen. So all attendees are muted and no one can see your video. We ask that attendees please post your questions in the Q&A. You should be able to see it at the bottom of your Zoom panel. If you have comments, you can use the chat for comments, but we ask that if you have questions again for the speakers in particular, that you put them in the Q&A. To receive your CEUs, we ask that you stay in the webinar for the entire duration. There are no partial credits given during webinars. It's a little different than live meetings. You have to answer the poll questions. There'll be poll questions after each of the talks, and you have to answer those. At least try, do your best. We'll talk about the answers to those as we go. For CCA credits, there'll be a QR code at the end of the meeting, or you can reply to the post-webinar email as well. For DPR credits, so QAL, QAC, PCA, etc., you need to follow the instructions for the final exam. It'll be sent right after the webinar in an email, and you need to get a 70% or better to receive CEUs. So our agenda for the day, I'm doing our little welcome here. We'll start in about another 10 minutes or so. Our first speaker will be Rebecca Ozeran from 9:10 to 9:35. Valerie Eviner is our second speaker. At 10 o'clock, we'll hear from Devii Rao, and then we'll have a little break. And during the break, apologize, I will give you guys some instructions on what to do during the break. We'll rejoin at 10:35 to hear from Tom Getz. After that, we'll hear from Chris McDonald at 11 and Scott Oneto at 11:25. We're going to do our best to stay on time today, and we should end by about noon, and we'll have a little bit of time for questions and answers if folks have a few at the end. Okay, our speaker lineup for the day, the folks that you're going to hear from in a moment. Rebecca Ozeran. Rebecca will be speaking about rangelands, fire and weeds, an ecological overview. Valerie Eviner. Valerie will be speaking about grassland management to influence fire severity and post-fire recovery in California. Devii Rao, prescribe fire and herbicides to control yellow star thistle. Tom Getz will be speaking about controlling winter annual grasses on rangelands of Northern California and implications for fire management. Chris McDonald will be speaking about weeds and grasslands, fire, fuels, and restorations. And Scott Oneto will finish up the webinar with managing invasive grasses in annual rangelands. And just a thank you before we get started here. So the UC Weed Research and Information Center with Gail Perez have done most of the footwork for putting on this webinar. And of course, we all have industry partners and collaborators that help us with our research, and UCCE and UC Davis staff and students. And of course, the biggest thank you goes to our California growers and ranchers, who without all of you, we would not be able to do this research. So thanks everyone, we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, so our first speaker is Rebecca Ozeran. Rebecca is a livestock and natural resource advisor with UCCE Fresno and Madera counties. So Rebecca, go ahead and share whenever you're ready.
All right, I'm also testing. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm using my phone, so hopefully it'll have better continuity of sound than my Wi-Fi typically does. So I will share my screen. All right, it might take a minute to get full screen. Is that full screen for everybody?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. All right, so yes, good morning, everybody. Thank you all so much for being here. My name, again, is Rebecca Ozeran. I am a Livestock and Natural Resources Advisor with Cooperative Extension in Fresno and Madera, as Whitney shared. And I'm going to start us off today with a brief overview of some of the ecological interactions of rangelands, fire, and weeds in California. So the overview today is going to be some of the basics of fire impacts to plant communities. I'll talk a little bit about historically fire-adapted plant communities. I'll talk about fire-adapted weeds and some of the principles of controlling them. And then I'll share some resources at the end if you have further questions. So right after a fire comes through, there are some immediate impacts. And then long-term, depending on the frequency of fire, there can be lasting impacts. So the immediate impact of a fire, as I've got these photos here, is that you can turn something like a grassland into what we might consider a blank slate, where there are abundant resources. That black char on the ground has a lot of nutrients. There's no more shading of the soil surface, and so there's abundant sunlight for new plants to grow. And there's little competition because all of the plants that had been there are no longer present to compete for those resources. Now, over time, I've got this series of arrows that we aren't always guaranteed the same outcome from a fire. And it depends, again, on the frequency of the fire and the type of fire that's coming through our landscape. So when we look at that blank slate, even just in that immediate outcome, we've got this combination of high resources. So although it looks like a blank slate from the surface of the soil, there are, again, a lot of resources, and there may be a lot of propagules or seeds or vegetative parts of plants that can reproduce and colonize the bare area. So the species that come back right after a burn will depend on what was there before. So those dominant pre-fire species, any species that are in areas that did not burn, that are bordering burn, and then anything that may not have been as obvious before, but may have been stimulated to grow because of the heat or the smoke from the fire itself. So right after a fire, we're going to get some sort of new growth, but it might be a new community. And in particular today, we're concerned it might be a new community that's dominated by weeds. Weeds love the blank slate. They're highly competitive and they will take advantage of those resources better than a lot of our desired species. So I've got this image of a rangeland in Madera County. And this is a photo of how it looked, a little zoomed in from the earlier example, right after a burn in 2017. And it might be a little hard to see, but in the background, if you can see my cursor, the burn extended out almost to this pond. And so the foreground of this area is really looking at the middle of a large burned area. And so in this burned area, again, that black char is a lot of resources, and there's nothing else that survived on the ground surface to compete for resources. And so this could be primed for a weed invasion. Now here's another example after a fire in Mendocino County. These were shared also in 2018. It also burned in 2017. And you can see a different kinds of responses to a fire on the same property. So this first photo shows in the foreground, there is a grass that did repopulate the area that burned. You can tell by the black charred trees that this was a pretty severe burn and it killed all of the trees. Some of them may be resprouting. We have a few shrubs and forbs that are coming back, but mostly it's the grasses. And unfortunately, this grass is considered an invasive species. This was knit grass and it's not what the rancher hoped to come back. Now, on the same property, we have very different experiences in different sites. So luckily for them, in the foreground here, you'll notice there's no grass. That means that the knit grass probably didn't have any seeds in this area of the property. And so the natural shrubs and forbs that were there before and some of the trees are what's coming back. In the background on the hillside, you can see that there is grass, and that's actually from an aerial seeding project that was done. And that was with Italian ryegrass, which was a desired forage species. So you can see that there's a mosaic of what happens on the landscape. And again, the weed control issue can be really important. So in general, rangelands in California have had a long history with fire. There have been millennia of weather ignitions from lightning and wind, and human ignitions, both intentional and unintentional, for many, many years. The severity and the duration of the fire varied across the landscape, And so this resulted over time in these different fire histories in our different ecosystems. And today I'm going to give a very brief insight into grasslands, chaparral, and deserts in California. Now, keep in mind, while I'm talking about these ecosystems, there's also fire adaptation at an individual plant level. The adaptations at the individual level contribute to the overall community's response to a fire. And so I'm going to include two key topics about plant responses and plant adaptations that I'll be referencing in the next few slides. The first one is the principle of avoidance. This is essentially a way that a plant avoids the harmful impacts of fire to itself. In many cases in California, this would be an annual grass that produces its seed, drops its seed, and senesces or dies in the spring, long before the fire comes through the area to burn it. And so there's no living plant matter on the grass to be harmed, and the seeds are typically safe on the soil surface. So in that way, it avoids the impact of fire. On the other side, there are fire-tolerant species, such as oaks, which can either withstand the heat of a fire or can recover after being damaged. And so I've got some photos on the right here where the oak on the top might have thick enough bark to withstand the heat of a grass fire, whereas on the bottom, you can see this oak is actually resprouting after a fire came in and destroyed the above ground material. And so there's avoidance, which just avoids the damage entirely, and tolerance, which can come back after damage. So we'll start with the grasslands and oak woodlands. These are very well adapted to fire. As I mentioned, most of our grasses in California are good at avoiding the negative impacts of fire. Our forbs or broadleaf plants like clovers and fillory also love to come in and populate burned areas because they can take advantage of the resources that are available when the grasses are no longer shading them out. And as I mentioned, oaks often will survive or resprout after a fire. So in these systems, we actually have positive uses of fire, such as oak management to do pest control on the acorn. We can absolutely use fire as a weed control tool in these systems, and it can be used as a fuel reduction tool, especially as we're having more communities living in these systems. The second system I want to talk about briefly is chaparral, which is our shrub-dominated system. This is also very well fire adapted, but at a different time scale than our grasslands. Our grasslands, with their finer fuels, are adapted to burning every maybe 5 to 30 years, whereas chaparral, those shrubs, are better adapted to burning every 50 to 100 years. The shrubs take a lot longer to regrow and regenerate after a fire than the grasses do. So these shrubs are adapted in terms of tolerance, not avoidance. The shrubs don't simply go to sleep and come back after a fire. They're typically living year-round, and so they're better able to resprout or to germinate from seeds on the soil surface. So in these systems, fire can also be used for constructive uses, such as to change the species composition, often used for ranching in actually reducing the amount of shrub cover by doing fire more frequently than the chaparral can tolerate, and that might ultimately shift the population away from chaparral and into a grassland system. And again, it can be used for fuels reduction or weed control, but has to be kept in mind that the frequency of fire that these shrubs can tolerate is much less than a grassland can tolerate. Finally, I do want to talk about California deserts, specifically thinking about those types of deserts with things like Joshua trees or cacti. These systems are mostly not fire adapted. They evolved with a very infrequent fire history, and the structure of these systems means that if a lightning bolt strikes one Joshua tree, there was typically nothing in between Joshua trees to connect them and to carry a fire. And so maybe one tree would die from a lightning strike, and that would be the end of the fire. This is one system where invasive grasses like medusa head and cheatgrass are a huge threat to the native biodiversity, because these new grasses are able to populate in between the existing native vegetation and carry a flame from one to the next. And unfortunately, these native trees and cacti are typically not able, they typically don't tolerate or avoid the impacts of fire, and they typically will die. So in these systems, historically, there was little beneficial use for fire, and now there may only be beneficial uses if we can find a way to use prescribed burning to reduce those invasive annual grasses. So hopefully from these brief overviews of the ecosystems, you've gotten some ideas of the challenges of weeds and fire in California. As I mentioned, weeds love a blank slate, and so after a fire is a very important time to do weed control because they might be better primed to take over your landscape than when there were a dense canopy of trees, shrubs, or grasses. Some other challenges of weeds in these systems is that many have fire-adapted characteristics, and I'll share a little bit more about that later. And as I do want to point out, a lot of these weeds also have similar and competitive biology to our desirable plants. So this photo on the bottom here shows Medusa head in the mix with several other dry annual grasses, just to highlight that at a certain point of the year, they're almost indistinguishable from one another in terms of how flammable they are and their impact to the ecosystem. So now we'll shift into some more details on how these weeds interact with fire. I'm going to describe kind of generally grasses, forbs or broadleaf plants, and woody species. I'm not going to go into the identification of these species, but if you have questions about identification, we have a great statewide network who can help. And I do want to point out on the woody species, I have included Himalaya blackberry, although it's typically a bigger issue in riparian or wet areas because it needs a lot more water than many of these other weeds in California. So keeping in mind, again, as you'll probably hear throughout the day today, that your control options have different costs in terms of actual money, your time and labor, as well as the timing in which they're most effective and the success rate that you'll have depending on the species of the weed that you're working with. So we really encourage you to know what you have so that you can take the right control approach. So some of the principles of controlling grasses, I'm sharing some of the features or the target points that we can think about, and then also the challenges of each of these kinds of plants. So the features of grasses is that they rely significantly on seed production to survive. And this means that we can effectively target seed production as the one time in their life that we want to stop them from producing. And so this can help us a lot with planning the timing of our control. Another feature of grass is that they are pretty small and delicate relative to some of our other species. And so this means we have a lot of treatment options, including grazing, burning, mechanical, and chemical options. These are the most flexible in terms of control options, but of course they also have their own challenges. One of the biggest challenges of these grasses, which you'll hear a lot more about later this morning, is that these grasses overlap a lot with desirable plants. You might see on the bottom left photo, I've got some red brome, which is that purple colored grass, but in the background and the foreground, there's also wild oats, and they're producing seeds at essentially the same time. And so controlling just one of those species can be very difficult to not harm your non-target desired species. Other challenges of grasses include their long-lived seeds, that you might have years of seeds built up in the soil, and a one fire might trigger germination of one set, but there will probably be more to deal with for a few years. The seed heads themselves make them less palatable and less grazable later in the season. So all of these photos kind of show most of these undesirable species have long awns that can be physical deterrents to grazing. And finally, although their small texture makes them have many options for control, it also means that they're a good fuel for fire. And so grasses, as I mentioned in the desert system, can actually increase the likelihood of a fire coming through and can increase the fire frequency. And to their benefit, these plants typically avoid the impact of fire. And so they can create these positive feedback loops where they propagate themselves and exclude other species. Now, this is a large table, and I don't expect you to remember any of this. I'll be happy to share my slides. This is just to show how these different grass species have multiple different control types that you can consider in your toolbox. And that mechanical, burning, grazing, and herbicide are all options at different times in these plant life cycles, excuse me. So we'll move on to the forbs. Again, those tables will be available to you after. Don't worry about the details right now. The features of forbs is that they tend to be a lot more distinctive than a grass. If you're driving past a pasture, you might be able to detect the bright purple flower on a thistle or the bright yellow of fiddleneck on the right there, but you probably couldn't tell from a distance whether you have Medusa head, barred goat grass, or wild oats growing in your pasture. And so this benefit of having that distinctive appearance, often very interesting looking leaves or stems, means that you're able to identify these plants faster and come up with a treatment plan sooner. Another benefit of forbs is that they often have a large leaf area. And so this can mean that either they'll be more palatable to grazing, as there's higher protein content in broader leaves than there is in grass, for instance. And it also might mean that you have a larger target area for chemical application. And finally, another feature which relates back to that distinctive appearance is the flower phenology can tell you at what stage of life this plant is. and can make it, again, easier to target the right time for applying your treatment technique. Of course, forbs also have challenges. Most importantly, they have a lot of grazing deterrents. And so those can include physical deterrents like the spines on that milk thistle on the top left. And they also include chemical deterrents, which can be considered toxins, such as the puncture vine in the middle of this slide and the fiddleneck on the right. And so this can mean that grazing becomes less of an option to control a lot of our forbs. Forbs are also challenging to deal with because they have a dual reproductive strategy. Many of them will be able to produce by seeds as well as vegetative spread. And so then you have to deal with root and stem systems being long-lived or regrowing, as well as the longevity of seeds in the seed bank. So I know, again, this is a huge table. This is, again, just to summarize the different options that are available for these kinds of plants. You'll notice that prescribed fire and grazing become less of options with our forbs, but mechanical and herbicide options are still pretty effective. And it, of course, depends on the timing and the specific species you're dealing with. So again, don't worry about memorizing any of this. Slides will be available. All right, our last plant type is going to be those woody species, including vines, shrubs, and trees. The features of these species is they tend to be highly visible. They're usually the largest kinds of plants we have. You'll be able to tell if you have, for instance, a tree of heaven in the middle of a pasture or a pile of Himalaya blackberry in your riparian area, pretty far away from them. Another benefit of these species, possibly excepting that blackberry, is that they tend to have slower population growth than, for instance, our grasses. If you have 10 grass plants this year, they create thousands of seeds. You might have 1,000 grass plants next year. You're less likely to have 10 trees this year and then 1,000 trees next year, depending on their reproductive mechanism. And so you might be able to have better, longer lasting impacts of successful treatments on these woody species to give you more time to come back and do a second treatment. Of course, again, there are always challenges. Woody species especially have good root systems, often tap roots, and sometimes rhizomes or longer stem systems. Again, of course, these are the largest plants that we're going to be dealing with, so you might need heavy equipment if you prefer to use mechanical removal, unlike with grasses where you don't always need heavy equipment. And the protective bark can mean that you need to have unique ways of applying herbicides if you're going to use chemical options, and it typically means that you won't be able to use grazing on these species either. So again, here are the woody species summarized in a table. Again, you'll notice grazing pretty much falls away as an option. Mechanical can be an option. Prescribed fire can help in terms of being combined with a second method, and then herbicides tend to be the fallback method for these plants. So in summary, I do want to bring us back to this picture just to share an actual success story that this photo of the burned area was actually before the photo of the grass. And so we got very fortunate that in this case, it was in the middle of the burn. There was no edge pressure from weeds. There had been years of consistent management, and so the seed bank was entirely these wild oats and some fillery, both of which were desired species on that property. And it meant that the things that were available were what came back, and they were predictable based on what had been done in the past. But this isn't always the case, and so we definitely encourage avid weed management and monitoring after fires because those are a very vulnerable point in time. So I do want to share resources very briefly. The Weed Control in Natural Areas book is a fantastic resource. You can get it online or buy it through your local cooperative extension office if they're open. The Weed Research and Information Center has good identification resources and other tools. And the Fish and Wildlife Service actually created a guide a few years ago on fire management and invasive plants, and it's a free PDF that you can download. So thank you. I'm happy to answer questions now.
Rebecca, you have two questions. The first one is, why is annual ryegrass a desired species? It is non-native and invasive.
That's a great question. So when you're thinking about reseeding a pasture, it 100% depends on what your goals are. In the case that I shared where they had seeded Italian rye or annual ryegrass, I believe their primary concern was erosion management and grazing ability, and it is a very palatable species, and so it was probably the best option for those two goals.
Sorry, wasn't unmuted there. The other question is, can you repeat the fire frequency in shrub versus grass ecosystems?
Yeah, so typically speaking, in the grassland systems, it's estimated that the natural fire frequency, whether considering lightning or human ignitions on purpose, they're adapted to between 5 and 30 years in between burns. But the chaparral systems, those shrub systems, are better adapted to 50 to 100 years in between burns.
Okay, and the last question is, can we have a link to that table, please?
Yes, so I will you can post my slides, Whitney, or we can find a way for me to get those tables out to everybody a different way.
Okay.
And I will say,
oh, go ahead, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, those are based on information in the Weed Control and Natural Areas Handbook. So that's a great resource.
Okay, thank you, Rebecca. If we do end up posting, everyone, we will email out to all the attendees afterwards. And then we'll go ahead and launch the poll really quickly, give everybody a chance to answer. And then once everyone has answered, Rebecca, you can address some of the incorrect answers. Okay, here we go.
Great.
Okay, attendees, you should be able to see the poll. So go ahead and answer. These polls you're not being graded on. This is just participation. So it doesn't matter if you get it wrong or right. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and end the poll. Okay. Okay, so everyone should be able to see the results now.
Okay. Yeah, looks like most everybody got the first one correct. You do to worry about weeds after a fire. They will take advantage of those resources that are available, especially the sunlight and the nutrients that are freed up and the lack of competition. They're highly competitive species. So false was the correct answer for number 1. Number 2, which of the following communities was not adapted to fire? Everybody, desert is definitely not adapted to fire the way that all of these other species have. So grasslands, chaparral, and oak woodlands are all okay with some free fire, and their species can come back or avoid the incident, but deserts typically do not have species that can avoid or come back after a fire. And number 3, what is most likely to increase fire frequency? You are correct. Grasses are absolutely the most likely to increase fire frequency because they increase the continuity of fire on the landscape as soon as there is some kind of ignition. They tend to be a little more separated from one another, and so increase the fire impact or how hot it burns, but they're not necessarily going to increase the frequency. Are there any other questions?
Okay, I see one more in the Q&A. Do you have an example of a chaparral community that has used prescribed fire to alter species composition with success?
You know, I don't think I can list any specific areas, but I do know shrub-dominated communities have been burned to reduce the presence of shrubs and convert them into a more grazable habitat. So maybe some of our other speakers today would have specific examples.
Okay, thank you very much, Rebecca. Oh, we've got one more. Okay, we've still got a little time, so it's okay. Cal Fire seems to encourage grass versus shrubs for fire management. Do you know why? Thank you.
That's a great question. And I would definitely suggest asking your local Cal Fire group what they typically think. My guess would be that Grasses, although they can increase the fire frequency, they tend to burn more quickly and at lower temperatures than shrubs. They're less hazardous to buildings, and they're easier to manage, for instance, around a home or around a barn than shrubs, which could burn very hot and cause us to burn down. And so it might just be and the amount of effort it takes to put out the fire rather than the frequency of fire that they're focusing on.
Okay, and one more question. What are the best ways to control wild oats? Grazing, timing?
You know, that's a great question. Typically, wild oats is a desired species on our rangelands, although it tends to be highly palatable. And so in grazed systems, it will be grazed, and there are probably times that you could increase the to reduce its seed production. Specific questions in your system, I would definitely recommend contacting a local person, either Cooperative Extension office, probably would be a good place to start, and they can help you make a management plan for getting rid of it if you want to get rid of it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Rebecca. Okay, we'll be moving on to the next talk here. So our next speaker is Valerie Eviner. She's a professor and ecologist with the Department of Plant Sciences at UC Davis. So Valerie, whenever you're ready.
Okay, I'm just getting the slide shared. All right, so thank you so much to Whitney and Gail for organizing this great session today. And I don't need to tell anybody in this audience that we know we are struggling with a lot more frequent fire than we're used to seeing. And so we don't always know what we're doing in terms of grassland management in the context of these large wildfires and in a number of sites, frequently repeated wildfires. And one key challenge is that the wildfire response is often pretty different from prescribed burns. And we have a lot of information from prescribed burns, but we have a lot less information, especially before and after, about prescribed fires. And so we had a great opportunity at Hopland Research and Extension Center to get a better sense of what the effects of wildfire are compared to unburned compared to prescribed fire. And this was, we happen to have a number of long-term study sites at Hopland for about 12 years before the Mendocino fire hit in July 2018. When you look at the landscape at Hopland, it was on the edge of the Mendocino fire. So that gives us areas that were exposed to wildfire adjacent to areas that were unburned. What we also had was very different grazing practices across different pastures at Hopland. And so here you can see in the foreground, it was an ungrazed pasture that burned very heavily to the point that you can see here, the fence post actually burned adjacent to a heavily grazed pasture that you can barely even tell a burn hit that pasture. And then Hopland had also done a number of prescribed burns about a month before that wildfire hit. So we had a number of prescribed burns to look at that were outside the wildfire zone, but also some areas that had prescribed burns that also had the wildfire come through. And so this gave us the ability to be able to understand the effects of different kinds of fire on different species in the system. And so when we're thinking about rangelands, the first thing we always think about is forage production. So how do wildfires influence how much productivity there is the year after? And a great review of a number of studies by Teresa Bichetti and colleagues had found that in the first year after fire, on average, there's a decrease in forage productivity by 40%. And even 3 years after fire, there's some decrease. And that is totally the opposite of what we found, probably because the year after the Mendocino fire was a really wet year. And so as Rebecca had talked about, there's all of these potential stimulating impacts of the fire. A lot of nutrients are available. There's a lot less thatch that can be inhibiting in terms of shade. And so in black here we have our above ground biomass at peak biomass the spring after the fire. And for all the graphs, you'll see the unburned plots are on the left, the prescribed burn are in the middle, and the wildfire plots are on the right. So if you look at the unburned productivity compared to that of the prescribed burn and wildfire, you can see the fires greatly enhance productivity, so about 1.6-fold increase. If you look at our pictures, this is my collaborator, Mary Cadanasso, who's over 6 feet tall. This is her standing in an unburned plot. This is her on the same day standing in a burned plot, right? Very, very large difference in the grass height and the productivity. So this is in the ungrazed. When we look at the grazed, so the ungrazed is going to stay here in black. The gray now is our ungrazed pastures. And what you can see, very slight trend to increase biomass production with the fires, but essentially grazing really muted the stimulatory effect on forage production. And essentially, this is what we'd expect in terms of grazing. We know is going to decrease fuel load, so we expect a lower intensity of fire. So if there is a flush of nutrients and things like that, we expect that to be lower in a system where we've given the system less fuel and less intense fire. Where this becomes really critical in terms of thinking about vegetation composition and especially weeds is thinking about what the effects of potentially that decreased fire intensity in grazed areas will be on seed survival. And this is really important, especially for our annual grasses. Our annual grasses have very, very little seed bank. Maybe about 1% of seeds carry over from one year to the next in the soil. So in general, what happens is those seeds wind up falling right late in the spring. They sit in that thatch layer for most of the summer. So about 85% of seed production from a given year is sitting in that thatch layer, which makes it incredibly vulnerable to wildfire. This could provide a great opportunity or a big crash of our system, depending on your perspective, right? And Rebecca had mentioned that blank slate. So we're very concerned about to what extent do our seeds essentially get wiped out with the fire coming through. The only study we've seen that have looked at before and after a wildfire effects on the seed bank has been one done by E.D. Allen's lab, where they showed that overall there was a 7-fold loss in germination. So essentially 7-fold increase in dead seeds after fire. And germination of dominant grasses decreased 50-fold. So that's an incredible impact. And it's something that we're really concerned about. You can see in this picture, this is a bunch of goat grass seeds sitting on top of the soil surface after the fire came through. And whether this is viable or not is a really key management question. So first, we're going to look just at the general species composition. And thanks to Rebecca for doing such a great introduction of the key players in the system. So what we have here is in an ungrazed plot, same as before, unburns on the left, prescribed burns in the middle, and wildfires on the right. And here we have the number of seedlings that have emerged from a seedling core. So essentially, we took a core from all of, well, we took many cores from all of our pastures that included both the burned thatch layer as well as a few centimeters deep into the soil, brought them into the greenhouse and saw what seeds were viable and which ones emerged into seedlings. And so in this graph, the black bars are looking at grass germination and the red bars are looking at our forb or wildflower germination. And you can see that, right, unburned, not surprisingly, we have a huge number of grass seeds that are emerging. Those are greatly decreased. So we see a 7-fold decrease in germination of grasses in both prescribed and wildfires. So those fires did a very good job at very high seed mortality for the grasses. For the forbs in red, it's a much more muted effect. Here, the fires only decrease germination of forbs by about 33%. So this is ungrazed. How about grazed? So if we think about our biomass effects, we assume the fire has been more muted in the grazed, and so we'd see less of an impact on seed mortality. So the top graph is exactly what you just saw before in the ungrazed system. In the grazed plots, if again you start looking at the black bars, which are grasses, just as we'd expect, in the grazed system we have less fuel, less intense fire, much less mortality of our seeds. And so we see a lot more seedlings coming up in our prescribed and wildfires in grazed pastures than we did in ungrazed pastures. For our forbs, which are here in red, we see a really different pattern. And interestingly, right, we see actually more forbs coming up, especially in the wildfire, in the grazed system than the ungrazed. And this is really important. This feeds off really nicely of some recent work that Lauren Hallett and Katie Suding and colleagues had done at Sierra Foothills Research Extension Center, where they found that moderate grazing over time was really critical in keeping a very robust forb seed bank. So lots of wildflowers, seeds getting built up in that soil. And what they found was that was the most important thing in terms of drought resilience, that if you had good wildflower seed bank, when you had a crash due to drought, those forbs were able to come in and maintain productivity and diversity and cover and erosion control. So they were super important. We're seeing the same thing in terms of fire, right? The fact that we had grazing and wildfire actually increases forbs coming out really suggests that the long-term grazing has increased the seed bank of those emergency first responders we have in the system. So this is who survived in terms of seeds. What does that look like in terms of the end of the first growing season? So on this graph, again, we have unburned on the left, prescribed in the middle, and wildfire on the right. Again, black bars are grasses and red bars are forbs. We also now have green bars, which are our legumes or nitrogen fixing forbs. We couldn't usually tell the difference at the little tiny seedling stage, but at the flowering stage, they were very easy to tell. And then the blue bars are looking at bare ground. So not surprisingly, in the burn treatments, we had more bare ground. But when we think about the species composition, it's really surprising. Remember, our burned system, particularly in the ungrazed, had a huge hit on grass seed survival. But grass cover at the end of the first season barely changes in response to fire. So essentially this tells us that even with a highly knocked back seed bank, that grass can essentially come and still be dominant. But what we see with the forbs in red and the legumes in green is we also see that those greatly increase in response to fire, very much in keeping with what we know in our rangelands, where disturbances, the forbs and the legumes are very important in response to disturbances. What's also really important is the type of fire very much shifts who comes back. So in our prescribed fire, it was pretty much just erodium or filary. So it's a great forage species, but it's not very exciting in terms of diversity. Versus in the wildfire, we saw dozens of wildflower species coming up after fire. So large diversity of forbs, including some of our native bulbs. Same thing with legumes. In the prescribed fire, we essentially increased the clovers that we often see on dominating rangelands, so things like subclover and rose clover. Versus in the wildfire, we saw more than a dozen species of clover. We saw many species of lotus and a couple species of lupin, so much more diverse response in response to wildfire. We also saw, especially in wildfire, higher perennial grasses and higher amounts of perennial bulbs. So this is in the grazed. How about ungrazed? So from everything else we've saw about about grazed, we expect a more muted effect of fire on the composition. So again, the ungrazed you've just seen is on top, the grazed is on the bottom. And what's really interesting here is even though seed survival in the grazed system was much higher in response to prescribed fire and wildfire, that's where we see a decrease in grass cover, right? We don't see a decrease in grass cover in that ungrazed system in response to fire, even though the seed bank took such a big hit. But we do see some of that in response to grazing. And we also see a much larger increase in the amount of forbs and legumes. Right, we see in grazed systems a stronger change in vegetation composition compared to the ungrazed burn systems. So this is the general composition. How about our noxious weeds? And so in Hopland, when we're talking about noxious weeds, we're mostly talking about goat grass and Medusa head. And so these graphs are going to be parallel to what you've seen before. First, we're going to focus on the number of seedlings that are surviving. The black bars are goat grass and the red bars are Medusa head. And so when we're looking at our ungrazed system, which is the only graph you can see so far, and we look at Medusa head, very high in the unburned, virtually disappeared in both types of fire. For goat grass in the black, we definitely have a strong decrease in the surviving seed bank, but it's a little bit more muted than we see for Medusa head. Now, how does this compare to grazed pastures? So again, our ungrazed is just on top. Bottom is same thing, looking at black bars are goat grass, red bars are Medusa head. The first thing you'll notice very clearly, we have a lot more Medusa head seeds in our ungrazed system and a lot more goat grass seeds in our in our grazed, and a lot more Medusa head in our ungrazed pastures. When we look at the patterns, again, we do see decreases in both goat grass and Medusa head seeds that are surviving in response to fire in the grazed. But when we look at the amount of seeds that are left that are viable, there are more goat grass and Medusa head viable seeds in our grazed and our ungrazed pastures, which again makes sense because we know with the removal of biomass, we probably got a lot weaker fire coming through. So this is surviving seeds. How about percent cover? How about what was the actual vegetation that emerged after the first year? So you're going to keep seeing the seed survival on the left, and what we're adding on the right is the percent cover at the end of the first growing season after fire. And first, let's focus on the Medusa head in red, right? So in ungrazed, we see that both burns definitely decrease Medusa head cover, not as completely as they decrease Medusa head seed survival. So even a little bit of seed survival can lead to some recovery of Medusa head. When we look in our grazed pastures, we see that we have slightly dampened effect of grazing. So we still do see that our fires decrease Medusa head seed survival and cover, but not as strongly as they do in the ungrazed. Now, same graphs, we're just switching to focusing on goat grass instead. So again, when we think in the ungrazed system, we see a big hit in goat grass seed survival, but lots of goat grass still winds up establishing in that first year. So it's certainly, right, still manageable. Rebecca had talked about the importance of getting in there and controlling weeds immediately after fire, right? In case of wildfire, we've only got 10% goat grass cover. That's a really good time to get in there and do some long-term control options. Just as we saw with Medusa head, when we look at percent cover in the grazed system, we do have more muted effects of the wildfire. So we do have more goat grass cover in response to wildfire in the grazed system compared to the ungrazed. So this is that first growing season, 2019, after 1 year after fire. Does this partial recovery of goat grass and Medusa head just keep spiraling so that we have a lot of full recovery in the second season? So I just moved the 2019 data, the first data, over here to the left, and now we're going to add the 2020 data after the second year after the fire on the right. And essentially, if you look at the general trends in both goat grass and Medusa head in 2019, we see the same general trends in 2020 on both the grazed and ungrazed pasture. The one key difference is we see pretty strong recovery of goat grass in our prescribed fire in our ungrazed system, but we don't see that the little bit of recovery we had in the first year leads to even more in the second year. We're actually seeing about the same levels of control. So this is great news, because this means that seeds got knocked back enough and cover got knocked back enough that first year that couldn't fully recover the second year. It's Medusa head and goat grass, so they are going to recover. But what this tells us is we have a good window to do something about them. And the thing I'm going to suggest trying to do about them is thinking about native perennial grasses. So we had a lot more native perennial grasses than we had realized a lot of these sites, and we could see them resprouting within a couple weeks after fire. And this might be a good time post-fire to come in and reset some of our most invaded systems by planting in perennial grasses. And so just to show an example of this, this is a non-fire study we've done, but we planted goat grass and Medusa head seeds in green here with our dominant annual grasses. So things like our wild oats and our bromes and our exotic wild rye. And so in green here, we have the percent of Medusa head and goat grass when it was grown with those species. And right, essentially it was a little roller coaster. They were high some years, low other years, a super low year is in the middle of our drought. So we know that our dominant species aren't doing a very good job at suppressing goat grass and Medusa head. But at the same time, we also planted these noxious grass seeds with a mix of native grasses. So our purple needle grass and a few of our wild rye's. And those results are in blue. So this is looking at the percent cover of Medusa head and goat grass when planted with those noxious, with the natives. And you can see they still have some ups and downs, but they're kept suppressed to a much greater level. And so this is something that we are now working on to see, is post-fire a good window of opportunity to get native grasses in to suppress these noxious weeds. And so we're working with some of the UC Natural Reserve systems that just got hit by the LNU fire this last year to do some of this restoration and see if that works. Of course, fire is going to be very year dependent. It's going to be very site dependent. So we've had the good fortune to partner with Pepperwood Preserve as well as Sierra Foothills Research Extension Center, which have also had fires in some different years, and looking at the effects of fire and grazing interactions on vegetation. So just to sum up what we found, essentially when we're thinking about post-fire, the key first responders are going to be our native perennial grasses, our native bulbs, and our wildflowers. So it's super important to maintain them in the landscape because they're what is recovering best. And particularly those native grasses may provide some of the best long-term suppression of goat grass and Medusa head. When we think about grazing before the wildfire, it is really important in terms of enhancing that wildflower seed bank. So the resilience of our grasslands in response to things like drought and fire really depend on making sure we have a good seed bank, and moderate grazing levels really do provide that. We also see that fires actually can provide that as well. It gives them an opportunity to become a lot higher in cover, and then they can replenish the seed bank. In terms of grazing, it can be a really important tool in decreasing some of the wildfire impacts. So we get a lower burn intensity and less seed mortality, and we get higher recovery of forbs and legumes, which can be really good forage quality and really important for diversity. But grazing can also decrease some aspects of wildfire that are positive. So that big increase in forage production we have is muted in grazed pastures, and the decrease in goat grass and Medusa head we have in response to fire are also muted in grazed pastures. And finally, prescribed burns can be really important impacts on vegetation and particularly goatgrass and Medusa head, right? They can be really important, but they do have less recovery of diverse species than we see in wildfires. So thank you so much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Valerie. We have quite a few questions in the chat here. So the first question is, how do you account for the different effects of prescribed burns and wildfire? Is it just the time of year the fire occurs?
It's a really good question, and unfortunately, we don't fully know, right? Our best guess is it's a few things. So it is a different time of year. What we also know is it can be the same day, but if you're in a pasture, right, that's on a little bit hotter exposure than another, like you can get that sweet spot where you knock out, say, especially some of the noxious grass weeds on one, but not the other. So, right, it's not just about, right, that exact timing, but the local scale differences. We also, so there may be some aspect of that. We also know in general, prescribed fires don't tend to get as intense as some of these wildfires. And when folks have been studying prescribed fires and looking at post-vegetation recovery, they find that what comes in from the borders, so something Rebecca had talked about being really important, versus a wildfire is so much bigger that we don't have as much of that recruitment from the borders.
Okay, a similar question, how does fire timing affect your results?
Really good question. So based on what we've looked at, so far I can't answer that. Hopefully we've collected the data, we just haven't analyzed it yet, looking at, so this was a burn in late July into early August. The one in Sierra Foothills was, I think, late June. The ones at Pepperwood were late October into early November. So hopefully by comparing some of those, we'll be able to get some sense of, there's obviously site differences, but also we might get some sense of effects of when the fire is. But at least for the idea of, right, seeds that are sitting there in the thatch, our guess is once you've gotten to the point where the seeds have all fallen down into the thatch, it might be pretty similar.
Okay, there's quite a few questions, so I'm going to ask you one more, and then if you have time to type some answers,
sure,
we can launch the polls. Okay. How did the prescribed burns compare to those wildfires in intensity, heat, etc.?
Yeah, so unfortunately, it wasn't measured because obviously, right, the Hopland had done the prescribed fires to manage for goat grass, and it was just kind of the normal prescribed fires you always do to manage for that kind of thing. And so we didn't think to like measure those things because obviously we didn't know a wildfire was coming a month later. So certainly from our best indication is we did, because we had a lot of plots we were measuring for some other experiments across the station. So we did have biomass levels before and at least 12 of the sites. So we had biomass levels before the fire and then after the fire, and we actually had seed banks before and after the fire in at least a subset of the sites that we looked at. And then immediately after the fire, we took not only the seed bank samples, but we actually looked at right, the ash / remaining thatch, so we could get a sense of how intense things had burned. And we had actually a lot of equipment out there, and we could see how things, right, did our plastic boxes like completely disintegrate or were they slightly charred? So we had some general feel of that. So like our guesses is that the prescribed burns were far less intense than the wildfire was, but we didn't actually measure it. That's the thing with wildfires, like you don't know they're coming to measure things.
Okay, thank you, Valerie. I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll, everyone, and Valerie will try to answer some more of the questions in the Q&A. Okay, here we go. Okay, everyone should be able to vote now. Okay, there I see some votes coming in. Okay, give everyone a second or two more. Looks like most folks have voted. Okay, so Valerie, if you don't mind really quickly addressing
Sure.
the poll results. So question 1, when comparing wildfire versus prescribed fire effects on noxious grass seed survival.
So Whitney, I don't see them.
Oh, that's because I didn't share them.
There
you
we go. Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, so this first one is actually a little tricky, right? So it is, as everything in ecology is, it depends, right? So particularly for Medusa head, both prescribed fires and wildfires really knock them back to like extremely minimal levels. There was a slight lower amount of surviving seed of Medusa head than goat grass in the wildfire versus prescribed, but you know, it was so low you couldn't even see it. Goat grass did have more mortality in the wildfire. And then, yes, for grazing before wildfire leads to more muted effects on vegetation biomass and on goat grass and Medusa head reductions. But we actually see that in terms of wildflowers, they actually respond more in the grazed pastures than the ungrazed pastures.
Okay, so for question 2, grazing before a wildfire leads to more muted effects of wildfire on the vegetation community.
Oh, sorry, I just answered that.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Yeah.
All right, then that is it. Okay, so Valerie, if you have a moment to keep answering those questions, we would appreciate it.
Yes, I will keep answering.
Okay, thank you so much. And we'll go ahead and move on to the next presentation. Okay, so our next speaker, Devii Rao, and I'm going to be sharing the slides here. Devii, are you able to unmute yourself?
Okay, can you guys hear me?
Yes. Okay, so Devii is a Livestock and Natural Resources Advisor with UCCE, San Benito, Monterey, and Santa Cruz counties.
Thank you, Whitney. Yeah, I'm really excited to be with you guys here today. I'm sorry, my internet is extremely unstable yesterday and today. I've never had such bad internet problems before, so I apologize that I can't be with you through Zoom, but I'm here on the line. So Whitney's gonna move through my PowerPoint slides for me as I look at them on my own computer. So yeah, so I work in, like Whitney said, in San Benito, Monterey, and Santa Cruz counties. And today I'm going to be talking with you guys about basically a case study looking at a prescribed burn that we did along with herbicide treatment to control yellow star thistle. And for this project, I don't have any data, but I have some lessons learned that I can share. I'm not a prescribed fire person, and so just being able to get this burn done was sort of a big deal and took a huge amount of effort. And so it was the first burn that I was involved in coordinating, and so I didn't really have the bandwidth to add an experiment onto that, but I hope to in the future. So hopefully in the future I'll be back and I'll be able to talk to you guys and I'll have some data. But for this talk today, I just kind of want to tell you a little bit about what we did, why we did it, and what we learned from it. And before I get started, I think Rebecca maybe mentioned this book in her talk as well, but I kept getting kicked off the internet in the beginning, so I'm not sure. But I just wanted to mention this book. It's called Weed Control in Natural Areas. Oh, sorry, next slide, please. Do you guys see the book now? Okay, I'm going to assume so because I'm not hearing a response. So if you're on slide number 2, you should see the cover of Weed Control in Natural Areas in the Western United States. And
yes, we can see it.
Okay, awesome. I'm going to try to remember to tell you next slide. This is a really great book. It has a lot of different weeds that you will encounter on our California rangelands. It'll tell you how to identify them, what their biology is, and different weed control strategies, anything from hand removal, cultural removal or control options, herbicide, burning, all of those different options are in there. And you don't even have to buy the book. If you have internet access, you can just go to Google and type in UC weed report and then the name of the weed that you're trying to control. And the entry from this book will come up on the internet. Usually they're around maybe 2 to 3 pages per weed. And so I highly recommend, if you have a particular weed that you're interested in controlling, and you know the name of it anyway, just go to Google, type in UC weed report and the name of that weed, and you'll have all kinds of great weed control options that come up. So that's a great resource for you, and kind of helped us come up with our plan for this project. So next slide, please. So now you should be seeing a group of people with hand tools cutting some hand line. And before I talk about the burn itself, I just want to give you guys a little bit of history about San Benito County and the last few years, what it's taken us to get to the point where we've been able to do a little bit of burning. So in San Benito County, we have a weed management area, and each year we do a rancher seminar, which is very much like this meeting we're on right now, where we have weed talks for ranchers and farmers so they can get their continuing education credits. And a couple of years ago in 2017, somebody suggested, oh, at your next rancher seminar, you should have a talk with CAL FIRE and the Air Board and talk about prescribed burning as a way to control weeds. And I mentioned that to one rancher, and they sort of got upset with me. They were, basically saying, why would you even consider doing that? A talk on that topic, it's not something we can do, so why bother even talking about it? Let's just don't even bring it up. Let's move on. Let's pick another topic. And I thought that was a pretty interesting response. And I kept it in mind, and I was sort of a little hesitant about it, but I talked to a few other people, and I got encouragement to go ahead and have the CAL FIRE and Air Board folks come and talk, and they did. And then we invited them to come back and talk in 2018. And at each of those weed management area meetings, I did a survey asking people what their interest was in prescribed burning. And each time there were people who were really interested in it, but just felt like it wasn't an option. It used to be an option that ranchers were able to use, but over time, it no longer became really a viable option. But people were excited about the idea of maybe potentially being able to use fire again for a variety of reasons, including controlling weeds. And so then in 2019, we had a meeting. It was a half-day meeting that was entirely focused on prescribed burning and what it would take to do prescribed burning. We invited CAL FIRE, we invited the Air Board, we invited the Fire Safe Councils, all these different folks to come and talk about prescribed burning. And it was very well attended, and people were super enthusiastic about it. So at that point, we decided, well, what happened was Lania Quinn Davidson and Jeff Stackhouse are a couple of UC Cooperative Extension advisors up in Humboldt County, and they've been doing a lot of prescribed burning. They developed the first Prescribed Burn Association in California a few years back, and they had a little bit of extra funding, and they basically said, hey, if you have someone, a landowner down in your area who wants to test out a prescribed burn, we can help pay for that, and we can come help you coordinate it. And so thank you to Lania and Jeff for basically sending me down this path. So I found a landowner who wanted to use prescribed burning as a way to control yellow star thistle on her ranch. And so what you're seeing here is the field that we did end up burning. But right away, I want to talk about a couple of lessons learned. So the field that you're looking at in this picture is, you can't see it in the picture, but just off to the left of where you're looking is the landowner's house. So the landowner's house is immediately adjacent to this field, and this is the field that she wanted to burn to control yellow star thistle. And I was really concerned about that. I was not familiar at all with fire at that point, and I thought, well, that sounds really scary. We don't want to do a burn immediately next to your house. Let's burn the field across the street instead. That sounds safer. So that's what I thought we should do. So that was sort of the plan. And then we had a site visit, so when we looked at the field across the street, it looked good. There was plenty of grass, and there was plenty of yellow star thistle. And so we thought, okay, this is going to be a good field to burn. But then we went back out there with a burn boss and some CAL FIRE folks, And I want to just define what burn boss is, because I know that there's a lot of folks who probably aren't familiar with that term. So a burn boss is basically a trained, certified firefighter who can write prescribed burn plans, and they can lead prescribed burns on the day of the burn. So they have a lot of training, a lot of expertise. So we hired a burn boss to help lead this burn. So we went out to the site across the street and with the burn boss and with CAL FIRE when it was getting closer to the time we were actually going to burn. And since the time I had been there before, the field had been pretty heavily grazed. And so there was very little grass in the field to carry the fire. And the other thing that happened between the time I had been there previously was there was a whole bunch of summer mustard, or Hirschfeldia and Canna, that had come up. And Hirschfeldia, well, with the name summer mustard, that tells you that, it's surviving and green into the summer. And so for carrying a fire, you don't want to have a bunch of green, wet plants out there. So we realized it was just going to be too difficult to burn that field across the street, even though I thought it was going to be safer. And so the burn boss was not at all worried about burning the field next to the house. And so we went ahead and did that because there was more grass in that field next to the house to carry the fire. And even though you can see in the back of this picture sort of the light yellow, kind of greenish colored vegetation, there is still a lot of that summer mustard in this field, but less than there was in that previous field. And so we just went for it. We said, let's go ahead and just burn this field. So this is the field we decided to end up burning. And this prescribed burn was actually a training opportunity for the community. So this was not a burn that was conducted by only experts in firefighting and prescribed burning. We did have the burn boss who was leading the burn, but you can see all the folks here with hand tools. This was a learning experience for the community, so they could learn how to prepare a site for a prescribed burn, so they could use a drip torch, so they could do all the different aspects related to a prescribed burn. And so these folks are getting trained on how to use hand tools to cut a hand line. And so a hand line is, you can sort of see they're creating a little bit of bare ground. They're removing that vegetation in that line and creating basically a fire control line with hand tools. So they want to remove the vegetation, put it to bare mineral soil in order for the fire not to be able to cross from one side to the next. This site, I don't think we actually used this as a control line. This was more just for training purposes in this particular location. Okay, so next slide, please. Now you should see a picture of the burn boss with a whiteboard behind him. So, and I promise I will get into the specifics of yellow star thistle control, but I just want to talk a little bit about kind of the process of the burn and how to get the burn done before I talk about specifics related to the influence of burning on yellow star thistle. So there are a few different ways to do a prescribed burn. The main way that people have been using in recent years is working with CAL FIRE and going through their vegetation management program, their VMP program. And the second option is if if you're a landowner and you have experience with burning, it's totally fine in California. You have the ability to burn your own property yourself. And then a third main way that people get burns done is by hiring a burn boss. And that can be beneficial for several reasons. If you don't have experience, the burn boss comes with that experience, comes with some liability insurance, and that kind of thing. So the CAL FIRE option is really great in terms of CAL FIRE will take on the liability of the burn. So if something happens, CAL FIRE is liable. There's nothing on or I don't believe there's anything on the landowner, or if there is, it's very minimal, and CAL FIRE takes the brunt of it. But the challenge with CAL FIRE is they have so many people who want to do prescribed burns, and their time and staffing is so limited that they're not able to get to nearly as many as burns as people want to do. So CAL FIRE, burning with CAL FIRE's VMP program is a great option, but it could take 5 or 6 years or even more to get your burn done. So that's why hiring a burn boss can potentially be a better option, because you can get it done in a much more timely manner. However, it's going to cost you more money for sure if you're going to hire a burn boss. So in this picture, the guy with the red hat or helmet is Phil Dye. He's the burn boss we hired for this burn. And this is the day of the burn itself. And what Phil did was he identified different teams of people, and he identified who those team leaders were going to be and who was going to be doing what task. And here he's drawn out the burn unit and is describing how we're going to basically set up the burn, where we're going to start it, where the different teams are going to be set, and what they're going to do and how they're going to do it. So this is sort of the beginning activity on the day of a burn, just sort of getting oriented to the site and to the activities that will be taking place. And like I mentioned before, this burn was almost entirely done by just regular people from the community, although we did have some folks from CAL FIRE and the local fire, Hollister Fire came down they were just on site to sort of watch and learn about, the way we were doing it. But they didn't participate in the burn itself. They were just sort of there in case the burn got out of control, and then they could have come in to basically fight the fire at that point, but that was not necessary. In terms of safety, the burn boss wrote a burn plan ahead of time. He got permits from CAL FIRE and from the smoke permit from the Air Board. And in the burn plan itself, it has a prescription for how the burn will be done. So you only burn when, at certain temperatures, below certain wind speeds, when there's a certain moisture level. All of these kinds of environmental conditions have to be met and have to be within what is called the prescription in order for the burn to be done on that day. And if the weather, if something's out of prescription, then you don't do the burn. So that's one of the main sort of safety mechanisms, is having that well thought out burn plan and only burning within the prescription itself. So next slide, please. And in the next slide, you should see a red truck in the background and a small area of blackened ground, sort of in the just to the left of the truck. So what's going on here is we started the burn with a small test burn at the corner of the burn unit to make sure that the fire was behaving in the way that the burn boss expected it to behave, and making sure that the wind was blowing in the right direction, the flames were going in the direction that was expected, and that kind of thing. So we started with a small test burn, and then you can see in the forefront of the photo, there's a yellow hose, and this was a very small burn unit. It was only 3 acres. And what we did was we actually put what's called a hose lay. So basically we put a hose around the entire 3 acres. So if there were any issues, there's the one main hose and then all these little sub hoses coming off of it that can be picked up and used to spray different areas if fire got kind of beyond the burn unit itself. So that's another safety precaution that we took during this burn. Okay, next slide, please. So now you should see a little bit more of blackened area and somebody there with a drip torch basically laying down the fire. And another safety measure I wanted to mention is that on the burn day, we had a lot of really great community members, but many of which who had no experience with prescribed burning. So we always paired somebody who didn't have any experience with somebody who had quite a bit of experience with prescribed burning and firefighting. And so you can see folks in, there's a pair right there. Somebody kind of learning how to do the process and somebody being there just sort of monitoring, making sure there weren't any issues or problems coming up. Okay, next slide, please. I added this picture because you can see the house there, sort of toward the left of the image behind the trees. So you can see how close that the house was to the burn, which you can see maybe why I was a little concerned about doing it here. But it ended up being completely fine because of that burn plan, because of the prescription, because of the topography, all of these various things that the burn boss knew how the fire would respond and felt that it was not an issue at all. So that's something to keep in mind, that even if you want to burn an area, even if you think there might be some, challenges that would prevent you from doing it, that's not necessarily the case, and it's great to consult with an expert on that. Okay, so the next slide, you should see a little bit more of a close-up of the burn area, and at the top of the slide, it says nearly an inch of rain. We got nearly an inch of rain between May 15th and May 19th, which is a pretty late rain, and that's quite a bit of rain. And the burn was about 2.5 weeks later on June 6th. So that created some challenges for us that I'm going to talk about. But getting back to yellow star thistle. So for yellow star thistle, you want to burn when you see it just starting to flower, because at that time the seeds are not viable, so you're not getting a new crop of seeds, and your forage plants have already gone to seed. Your grasses have already gone to seed by then. So the grass seed has already been sort of dropped into the soil, and the grass by then is dry, and so it's going to carry the fire. So that's usually a really good time to burn. And one thing to note is that burning doesn't really kill the yellow star thistle seed in the soil, is what research has found, or if it does, researchers think it's very limited. So when you're doing a prescribed burn, the goal is not to kill the seed in the soil. The goal is to basically kill the plant and prevent that year's seed from being able to develop. And so the next thing I want to say, definitely pay close attention because there might be a question about this on the quiz. I wanted to mention that although burning doesn't really influence the seed in the seed bank in terms of killing the seed in the soil, fire does really have an influence on the seed germinating in the next year after the burn. So presumably at your site where you have yellow star thistle, you probably have had yellow star thistle at that site for many years, and so there's sort of a buildup of yellow star thistle seed in the seed bank. So when you burn that yellow star thistle, when you burn that site, that yellow star thistle seed in the soil in the seed bank there is actually sort of encouraged to germinate and grow the following year. So when you do a burn to control yellow star thistle, you really need to do a follow-up treatment, because if you burn it, you're actually encouraging the seeds more seeds to germinate the next year than if you didn't burn. So when you use prescribed burning to control yellow star thistle, the burn really is phase 1 of your control strategy. You want to burn, and you do want to increase that germination. So it's not a bad thing that when you burn, you get more germination of that yellow star thistle the next year. You actually want that to happen. You want to stimulate that yellow star thistle seed in the seed bank to germinate, because then it's out of the ground and it's up, and then you can actually do a follow-up treatment, and you're actually killing more yellow star thistle plants because of that increased germination. So in terms of a good yellow star thistle control strategy, like I said, it really requires multiple years of management. You can't just do a burn and be done with it, or you can't just do an herbicide treatment and be done with it. So with burning, what the research has shown is that with burning, you really get the best results if you burn in year 1. So in the first year, you do a prescribed burn, and then you get that higher level of germination the next fall. And so you've got sort of a bigger weed yellow star thistle infestation problem the next fall. So then what you do then is phase 2 would be going back to that same site and following up with a broadcast herbicide treatment over the entire site. So that would be year 2, broadcast herbicide treatment. And then in year 3, going back to the plants, maybe you didn't get a certain area, you might need to go back and do some spot spraying in year 3. So you're still using herbicide, but much less of it, only in targeted areas. And then after year 3, there's probably still going to be some work to do. So you can follow up maybe with some more spot spraying, or it might be controllable enough to the point where you can just go out and do some hand removing here and there, depending on the scale of your site. So just to summarize that, really a great strategy, yellow star control strategy, is to burn in year 1, and then year 2, you follow up with a herbicide treatment to kill all those young plants that have germinated, and then in year 3, doing a spot spray. So I also wanted to point out another lesson learned from this project. So like I said, we did that burn, the prescribed burn, on June 6th. Oh, sorry, hang on just one second. Oh, and I need to wrap it up. So what is the best way for me to wrap this up? It was a challenge to get the site burned to what we wanted to, because of the wetness, because of the moisture from that fire. I'll quickly say that we did a debrief at the end with the whole team to figure out what went well, what didn't go well, and here's what the burn looked like at the end. I'm going to skip all this stuff, but we followed up with a capstone, which is a combination of triclopyr, which is garlan, and aminopyrrolid, which is milestone. We sprayed 3 quarts per acre of the capstone. And the milestone was good for killing the yellow star thistle. The garland was good for killing the mustard. And in the end, a big comparison. Here's what it looked like before the burn. If you look between the 2 red arrows, you can see lots of mustard and yellow star thistle. And after the burn and after the herbicide control, you can see lots and lots of grass. And so I would say it did a really good, the burn and the follow-up herbicide treatment did a really great job of controlling yellow star thistle. And we did a little bit of seeding in there as well with blando brome. There's a bunch of blando brome in there as well. So with that, I'll wrap it up.
Thank you, Devii. Sorry to rush you towards the end there. I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll. There's quite a few questions in the Q&A, but okay. I am not sure if are you able to see the
I can't see the Q&A. I'll try to log in, but I'm probably going to get kicked off.
Okay. Okay. Well, I'll at least launch the poll here, and then we'll let everyone give, or you can give the answers to the poll at least.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. So we'll go ahead and launch the poll, everyone, and give everyone a moment to vote here. Okay, everyone should be able to see the poll now. Okay, I'll give everyone a couple more seconds here, and then we'll go through the questions. Okay, I'm gonna end the poll here. Okay, so Devii, the first question was, how does fire influence yellow star thistle seed germination the year after a prescribed burn? And 94% of the respondents answered fire actually encourages yellow star thistle seed to germinate, so you may get even higher levels of yellow star thistle germination the year after a fire.
Yep, and that is the correct answer. And for some reason, I am able to get on, so I can see that only 5% of folks said that fire does not influence yellow star thistle germination in the year following the fire. So yeah, just about everyone got that one right. I don't know that I need to explain it more than that. I think I went into it in pretty much detail, but yes, definitely if you do a prescribed burn, it's definitely going to encourage that seed bank in the soil to germinate the following year, so you'll get even more growth. So it's really important to follow up with a treatment in year 2.
Okay, so the second question was, yellow star thistle requires multiple years of management in order to get it under control. Which of the following strategies is most likely to be effective?
Yeah, and so it looks like just about everyone got that one right as well. So in year 1, doing a prescribed burn and then following up with a herbicide treatment in year 2 across the entire area. And then by year 3, you still want to be controlling, but following up with less intensive control, like maybe spot spraying. And then after that, potentially, you know, just by hand removal is the goal. And in many cases works quite well.
Okay, thank you, Devii. If you wouldn't mind sticking around for a moment to, if you can answer, there's quite a few questions, I think 8 total in the Q&A.
Okay, so I just logged back in, and so I can't actually see the questions. Can you like highlight them and paste them into a message just to me, and then I will try to respond
Sure,
to
I'm happy to do that. Okay, so everyone, we are going to take a break very quickly here. Not a super long break until 10:35, so quick break till 10:35, and then we'll rejoin the meeting. So while you're on break, please don't log out. Leave yourself logged in, and we will see you all back at 10:35. Okay, everyone, we are back. We're going to go ahead and get started again. So our next speaker is Tom Getz. He's a weed ecology and cropping systems advisor in UCCE Lassen, Modoc, Plumas, and Sierra counties. Sorry for the mispronunciation there. Tom, okay, you're ready to go.
Awesome. Well, thank you for the introduction, Whitney, and thank you for the invitation to speak today. Hopefully everybody can hear me all right. A lot of good talks so far, and I've learned a lot and excited to be here. I'm going to be talking about a different portion of the state, the area that I work in the Intermountain region, and I'm going to be talking about specifically managing invasive annual grasses. So let's see here if it's going to let me change slides or if it's not going to let me change slides. Okay, sorry about that. So I'm just going to get into a little bit of background information about the ecotypes in the Intermountain region, highlight the 3 invasive annual grasses that we deal with a bit and how they interact with fire, talk a little bit about sage grouse, and then get into general management, followed up by some of the recent research that I've been doing with indazaplam. So in terms of the Intermountain area, it's this northern portion of the state, much more similar to the Intermountain West, generally throughout. It's a very interesting region where the Cascades meet the Sierra Nevada, and you have the Modoc Plateau. A bunch of different vegetation types, some brush-dominated landscapes, bitterbrush, lots of sagebrush and juniper, lots of forested pine ecosystems. And unlike some other portions of the state, the desirable grass species, both for livestock and land managers, are perennial bunch grasses. And really in all of these ecosystems, historically there used to be spaces between fuels, which is really where winter annual grasses come into play. These grasses germinate with the first spring rains and are very competitive and provide very fine fuels that really drive fire within these ecosystems. So the first grass I want to talk about is cheatgrass, very widespread throughout California and really widespread throughout the western United States. It's estimated there's over 100 million acres infested with cheatgrass. Winter annual, and it's named cheatgrass because it germinates and grows throughout the winter season, but then is able to capture nutrients and resources that would have been used by those perennial species, and it dries out really before any of those perennial species get going in the spring. Another invasive annual that is much more dominant on some of our heavy clay sorts of soils and quite widespread throughout California, already been mentioned quite a few times today, is medusa head. much later or maturing annual grass species, but very competitive and really has the ability to carry fire as well. And then one that is much more, I believe, on people's radar up in Washington, Oregon, and Idaho is Vetinata, or North African wiregrass. Looking at the CalFlora map, it's not nearly as widespread within California, but I think that this map might not be as representative. I didn't know how to identify this grass when I first got here to the state, and I put 5 or 6 dots on this map. I see it growing lots of different places where both cheatgrass and Medusa head grow. And from talking to some of the people up in Washington and Oregon, they actually are seeing this grass start to take over and outcompete rangelands that are dominated currently with Medusa head and cheatgrass. Quick shout out in terms of trying to identify these different grasses, which can always be difficult in the seedling stages. Wyoming put together a great management guide, just Wyoming's invasive grass quick guide, that allows you to walk through and look at some of these different grasses graphically. So what sort of impacts do these grasses have? Well, first and foremost, they really have the ability to create monocultures, crowding out more desirable species. And in terms of this talk, that jumped ahead on me. They really have the ability to increase fire frequencies and fire regimes connecting fuels. Many of these ecosystems were adapted with fire, but they were adapted with fire at small scale, patchy sorts of fires that burned, occasionally. With these fine fuels and these invasive winter annual grasses that have the ability to grow within all of these ecotypes, fire regimes have increased dramatically, where you have fine, flashy fuels that really can increase the amount of fire on the landscape and really increase the size of the fires that occur. Specifically connecting some of these perennial vegetation types that historically didn't have fire between them to connect them for large-scale burning. So I stole this picture from a trip out to the Santa Rosa Range in Nevada, but it looks very similar to many sites in eastern Lassen County, where we have a low sagebrush system with lots of perennial grasses here, but you can see there's a lot of bare ground. There's not a lot of fuel between those vegetation types to carry fuel. Where the invasive annual grasses come in, they provide that fuel. Here's a picture of some cheatgrass all dried out in the wintertime. And here's a picture of a low sagebrush ecosystem completely invaded by cheatgrass and Medusa head, where it's a continuous fuel blanket between those perennial shrubs. Sagebrush does not resprout, juniper does not resprout, and when you have a fire come through, those invasive annuals are able to carry that fire and really torch those perennial components of the ecosystem that don't come back. Here's a picture of a mountainside and an old fire scar. So the top of the mountain burned, and essentially it just came back with some perennial grasses, but mainly invasive annuals, where all of this blue sagebrush is an area that didn't burn. Historically, this mountain would have been covered in sagebrush, but after the fire, the invasive annuals are too competitive, and they are what comes back in the system. This is, similar for some of the juniper systems, heavily invaded by invasive annual grasses. Here's a picture of the gold fire up in Lassen County right after ignition this past year in 2020. Just getting started, burning pretty heavily in some juniper woodlands fueled by the invasive annuals. And here's a picture of a fire in a mixed conifer stand. And you can't really see it very well, but over here in the corner where you get this little bit of a fire line, those are a bunch of invasive annuals that are fueling this fire and driving it within this system. So they really do have the ability to carry fire. And if you don't have other things, in the seed bank coming back, they really have the ability to create these dense monocultures after fire or multiple fires have occurred. We've had a lot of fire, throughout the past 50 years, and the dynamics of our fire have changed with the historic fire suppression that we've had. This is a graphic that I stole from Janine Little, looking at fire history in both Lassen and Modoc counties. But just to highlight, the historic fire season that we had here in 2020, within the counties that I worked in, we had about 680,000 acres burn, a lot of that in the Bear Fire. But some of these other fires were really heavily dominated by invasive annual grasses. The Caldwell fire, the W5 Cold Springs fire, the Gold fire, and the Loyalton fire, these were all, driven by some of those invasive annual grasses that I've been talking about. And one thing that I'd like to mention, and one of the big proponents or why people are trying to manage invasive annual grasses besides reducing fire risk, is because of, their impacts on some of our native species. There's a lot of money and funding right now when it comes to sage grouse, which is a bird that's, on the brink of being on the threatened list, but there's a lot of money and funding going into protecting its habitat. The sagebrush communities that it lives in, which are present in northeastern California and on the eastern Sierra, are rapidly deteriorating because of these fires. The invasive annuals are able to connect those fuel sources, and you can have stand replacing fires, reducing the habitat for the sage grouse, which depend on the sagebrush for both food as well as cover. And then they also depend on annual species or seeds that are really heavily outcompeted by the invasive annuals. So, millions and millions of acres are currently infested and overtaken by these invasive annuals. There's a lot of money and funding and work going into protecting key habitat, for species like the sage grouse, by creating green strips and fuel breaks to keep areas that haven't burned from burning. Really an interesting looking bird. They're pretty cool, especially in their mating ceremonies. Here's a male in a lek. And so now shifting gears a little bit to, more management of these invasive annual grasses, I wanted to highlight two resources. One that's already been talked about quite a bit, the weed control in natural areas of the Western United States, and another resource from Guy Kaiser and Joe DiTomaso, as well as others, looking at medusa head management. Both of these are excellent resources, and a lot of the general information I'll be sharing today is coming from these two resources. I highly encourage you to look them up. So in terms of, how can you manage these invasive annual grasses on the landscape, specifically to create some of these fuel breaks to keep some of these areas from burning that haven't burned yet. And, in terms of mechanical techniques, they're, theoretically, you can definitely hand pull annual grasses in, agricultural systems. Tillage can be quite effective, for an individual year of control. But on rangeland systems, a lot of which it look like this, lots of volcanic rock, there really isn't an effective or realistic way to go after these annual grasses with mechanical means, even though theoretically they could be effective. Fire in these perennial dominated ecosystems at these higher elevations, fire can be a great way to suppress some of these invasive annuals, like we've heard in other presentations at lower elevations. Typically in our perennial dominated systems in the Intermountain region, fire just is a self-perpetuating cycle that increases invasive annual grass domination on the landscape. But there is one proponent of fire that I think really fits in place with an integrated pest management approach, is it has the ability to reduce thatch layers on site or reduce the amount of invasive annual grass cover for an individual year, which can be a great opportunity to come in and do some seedings, or a great opportunity to make some herbicide applications, herbicides that might be affected and tied up in that thatch layer. So if you have a fire, it definitely can be a good opportunity to strike and try to get something more desirable on site. In terms of grazing, there has been quite a bit of work looking at high intensity and short duration grazing for suppression of some of these annual grass species, but generally on the landscape scale, it's not something that land managers are typically using. But again, it can be quite effective in combination with herbicides for reducing some of those thatch layers. And then biological, everybody loves biological control. I'm sure some of you have heard about some of the weed suppressive bacteria work that was done by Ann Kennedy up in Washington. I'm looking at this bacteria that was inhibiting weed growth in some of these invasive annual species. And well, it looked really good in the lab, to my understanding, and following up with a lot of scientists who have been trying to replicate that work in the field. The short answer is no. They haven't been able to get good control at the field level with some of these suppressive bacteria. This is a publication put out just this year by the USGS, I believe, out of Oregon, detailing some of the work that they've been doing with bacteria. And unfortunately, there are not a lot of biological control options available for these grasses. So land managers are really tasked with controlling these species and often rely upon herbicides for control. I'm just going to run through a couple of classes of herbicides and point out, some pros and cons. The ACC-ACE inhibitors are the grass killers, clethodim and flazophop. Typically, these are not for range and natural areas, although they can be very effective as a post-emergent treatment for annual grasses. However, they kill desirable grasses as well. But if you look up the labels, there are some certain supplemental labels in certain situations where you might be able to use them in some of those range and natural areas. Glyphosate, well, being a broad spectrum herbicide and being very effective, is non-selective. However, if you use it in the Intermountain region during the dormant season, that timing of application can actually give you some selectivity. Making applications in the late winter after those winter annual grasses have germinated and started to grow, but before those perennials are actively growing, you can make applications of glyphosate over the top of those dormant perennials and control a lot of those invasive annuals. There's been some interesting work done there. Two products that people often rely upon for one good season of control are the pre-emergent products in the sulfonylurea family, rimsulfuron matrix or sulfometron oust. And these products can be applied in typically the best applications are in the fall, right after the annual grasses have germinated, or ideally before germination has occurred. And generally, you can get pretty good perennial grass safety as long as those perennial grasses are not, actively growing. Outside of California, I just want to mention imazapic because this is definitely the standard for medusa head, cheatgrass, and ventonata control outside of the state, and it's similar to the sulfonylureas in terms of you can get 1 year of control, but unfortunately, it's not labeled here in the state of California. And more recently, there's been a lot of really interesting work being done with aminopyrrolate or milestone, the PGR herbicide. There's been some work done by Guy Kaiser and Josh Devii looking at pre-emergent treatments of really high rates. And, at the spot rate, they've shown really effective control at some of their lower elevation sites. At some of my trials, I didn't have as good a control with these pre-emergent treatments. But what I think is more promising and really interesting to me is some of the work done by Matt Ranella, Josh Devii, Guy Kaiser, and Valerie Eviner, looking at boot stage applications of aminopyrrolate to medusa head. So essentially, when that seed head is in development in the sheath of the grass, making applications of low rates of aminopyrrolate have been shown to offer seed head sterilization. So in a short-lived species like medusa head, where you don't have a long seed bank, sterilizing the seed production for multiple years in a row eventually should shift that community to something not dominated by those invasive annuals. And I did put out a demonstration trial just because a bunch of folks were interested in the mountain region. They hadn't seen it done. And this picture, all this purple area, was area that was treated with different rates of milestone or aminopyrrolate. Here's an untreated check. In terms of what the grasses looked like all zoomed up, where we made treatments, we were getting a lot of purpling, and we didn't appear to have a lot of seeds being produced. Where in the untreated, the medusa head was quite nice, white, and very healthy. And a quick and dirty seed germination analysis that I did showed that we had about 95% germination of the seeds in the untreated check, where we had very little germination in the areas that have been treated with that aminopyrrolate at the boot stage for medusa head. So replicating what those others have done, and really interesting, promising work. Wanted to end with and just show some pictures from some of the work that I've been doing with indaziflam, or a tree and vine herbicide. As many may know, if you own any trees, marketed under the trade name Allion. But in the non-crop market, it's marketed as Esplanade. And more recently, outside of California, it has gotten a grazing label, and eventually the company is going to try to market it in California under the trade name Rejuvra. But at this point, it can't be used in grazed areas. But this is a seedling germination inhibitor that's put on before any of those winter annual grasses germinate, and it's shown to be very effective. Some of the work done in Colorado, started back in 2015 with Derek Sebastian, where they made applications of esplanade to areas that were infested with cheatgrass. And here's a picture of a non-treated area with cheatgrass. And then this is the area that they treated 2 years out. And essentially what they were able to do is get 95% control of that cheatgrass with a single application, really releasing desirable perennials that were already established on site. And I believe that this is where the biggest fit for this product might be, is where you already have some desirable perennials established on site. And as they continued to follow these trials, they were seeing 3, even 4 years of cheatgrass suppression with a single application. So I just wanted to walk through and show some pictures from a few trials that I had up in the Intermountain region. I had some treatments that were put out as pre-emergent treatments in the fall of 2016, some that were put out as early post-emergent treatments at a more degraded site, and then an area that we were trying to come through and seed to see if you could get something growing through the places where the herbicide had been sprayed. So in one of the pre-emergent sites that I had, we had a good stand of perennial grasses. This is a picture of one of the other herbicide treatments tested, panoramic or imazapic, where we weren't getting very good control, where with our esplanade or indaziflame application, we were getting excellent control. Really opening up the inner spaces between these perennial grasses and controlling the medusa head between them. So 2 years after treatment, the untreated checks still look like a nice mat of medusa head, where that esplanade application 2 years after application was still keeping excellent control, releasing some of those perennial grasses. 3 years out in 2019, unfortunately, the electric fence went down. And so here's where it was untreated, and here where it was treated. So didn't get any data off of this site, but we were still getting a good suppression in some of these treatments. So like the work that's been done in Washington and Colorado, it seems like there really is some good perennial safety, although, certain perennials might be sensitive, and really excellent control of medusa head here in California. And other states have shown excellent control of cheatgrass and ventonata, much longer than some of those other herbicides that are currently on the market. But lots of our sites in the Intermountain region look more like this. Really dominated by some of the invasive annuals, and there's not a lot of desirables left. So here's a picture of some plots that I had. Again, these were put out early post-emergent. Matrix giving pretty good suppression. Esplanade looking absolutely lights out, 7 months out. 18 months out or 2 years after treatment, the industry standard outside of California, plateau or imazapic, had really started to break. Esplanade was essentially providing bare ground in this treatment 2 years after application, with a couple of non-desirable weeds coming in. 3 years out, those other herbicides didn't look like we had even sprayed them, where some of our treatments of Esplanade 3 years out were starting to break and getting some medusa head coming in, where other treatments essentially were giving us still 95% bare ground, which is not that scary on a 10 by 20 foot plot. But if you were to treat a couple hundred acres where you didn't have any desirable remnant plant community there, it could be a really scary sort of proposition if you weren't able to get something to come back. So that was the last trial that we looked at, where we were trying to seed into some of these areas. And we had some applications that were put out where we wanted to see if we could drill seed into the residue. Broadcast seeding probably wouldn't work, but if we could drill seed down through that layer, we might have some success. 2 years after treatment, essentially only Esplanade was giving us any control. The other treatments that gave us suppression initially 1 year out were not. Just a picture of the site 2 months after treatment, lots of bare ground. The first seeding that we did 1 year after treatment, we didn't get any precipitation, so we didn't get any germination, as is often the case with dry land seedings. You don't get rain, you don't get establishment. Where in our second seeding, we came in 2 years after the initial treatments, and we drill seeded into the plots a bunch of different grasses. And we didn't have success of all of the grasses that we seeded, but we had success of a couple of the grasses. We had good germination and establishment of intermediate wheatgrass, as well as a western wheatgrass, essentially only where we had bare ground or where we were getting control of that those invasive annuals. Where we had other weeds like red stem Valerie come in, we didn't get establishment, and where we didn't control the medusa head, we didn't get establishment either. So 38 months after application, 3 years and after treatment, You know, lots of our treatments were looking really good, and we had some established desirable perennials coming back. Where in some of our other treatments, they were on these small plot scales really starting to be reinvaded. But with this indaziflam treatment, and like they've seen in other states, I think there's a lot of potential to control these invasive annuals where you already have perennials established. This is a picture of a site where a land manager trying to protect some sage grouse habitat made a large-scale aerial application. And here in the foreground, you can see all these desirable perennial species with a bunch of dead medusa head 1 year after treatment, where this whole back part of it is all dominated by that invasive annual that would really carry fire. You know, fire is not going to carry through a system like this nearly as readily as it's going to carry through a system like this. And just to show you a picture, another picture from the air, this is a picture of that treated strip 1 year after application, where they were able to get really good control and create a fire break to hopefully protect some sagebrush and protect some sage grouse habitat. And with that, I think I went over what I should have, but I'll take any questions.
Thank you, Tom. You have one question in the Q&A. Is Esplanade effective on yellow star thistle as a pre-emergent treatment?
That is a good question. I'm not sure if Esplanade would be effective on yellow star thistle. That's something I could certainly look into, but off the top of my head, I know it's effective on a lot of annual species, but I'm not sure if yellow star thistle is one that's on the label or not.
Okay, thank you. Oh, one more popped up. Collateral damage to native annual forbs with Esplanade.
That is a really excellent question. There is certainly a lot of potential for collateral damage to any sort of annual species. We did, in some of the work that I've done, I've had a lot of various annual species come up in the plots, but you know, more of them are weedy, like or I consider red stem filariae more of a weedy species. Prickly lettuce seems to be quite tolerant of Esplanade and came up in quite a few of the plots. I did have some wild sunflowers come up that next year after treatment, but there is a lot of potential, and there just isn't enough research at this point to really determine what species are tolerant or not tolerant, especially when it comes to those annuals versus perennials.
Okay, I went ahead and launched the poll, so if there are additional questions, Tom, if you wouldn't mind answering them, typing into the Q&A, that would be appreciated.
No problem, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you. We'll give you a second to address the poll question answers here in a moment. I'll give everybody a minute or two here. Okay, about 10 more seconds to vote. Remember, these doesn't matter if you get them right or wrong. Okay, Tom, if you wouldn't mind addressing can you see the
Yeah,
questions?
I can see
okay.
the poll. It looks like 98% got the first one right. Invasive annual species, such as the three I mentioned, really have the ability to carry fire. Didn't make these questions very hard. Esplanade did seem to be effective for medusa head control, as well as cheatgrass and ventonata control. And then 93% got right that sage grouse is the bird's habitat that has been threatened. So very well done.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Okay, we're going to move on to our next speaker here. Our next speaker is Chris McDonald. He is the Inland and Desert Natural Resources Advisor with UCCE San Bernardino, Imperial, Riverside, and San Diego counties. Go ahead.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm the Natural Resources Advisor for Cooperative Extension in Southern California. And today I'm talking about grasslands in Southern California. Here we go. So our Southern California grasslands look very similar to grasslands found all over the world. Grasslands are pretty easy to identify. You kind of know you're standing in a grassland. Unlike some of our other communities like coastal sage scrub or chaparral that you might find in Southern California. Yeah, you kind of know when you're in a grassland. It's pretty easy. So kind of focusing on the map of grasslands in Southern California here, we don't really have that many compared to the northern parts of the state where there's, tens and thousands of acres of grasslands. And our grasslands tend to be mostly scattered. We do have two types, being that we have kind of the desert grasslands and the Mojave and Sonoran. And I'm pretty much going to ignore those for the purpose of this talk and audience. And the desert grasslands I'm referring to are like the Guyetta grasslands, the Hilaria. I'm going to be focusing more on our inland grasslands, not the desert grasslands. Well, I kind of want to point out here that our grasslands kind of come in a different flavor than in Northern California. Southern California is hotter, drier, and we get a very strong, consistent fall, winter wind in the Santa Anas than in Northern California. And so our grassland plants experience less consistent soil moisture, and there's more drought stress. And this kind of relates to having, like I said, a different flavor of grasslands in Southern California. Our dominant weeds in our grasslands are ripgut and red brome, wild oats, tocolote, also known as Malta star thistle, storkbill or phyllories, wild barleys like hordeums, black mustard, short-potted mustard. And we do not have very much cheatgrass, yellow star thistle, the tall lepidiums like perennial pepperweed or tall whitetop. We hardly have any medusa head in Southern California. We have even less barbed goat grass. And adjacent to our grasslands, we have very little French and Scotch brooms. So while many of you are kind of focused on those weeds in the previous talks that preceded me, we just don't have a lot of those weeds. And part of that's just because they haven't got here yet. And part of that's because it's just not the right climate for those weeds to really thrive in Southern California. I'm going to spend a good chunk of time talking about the three different kinds of grasslands that we have in Southern California. And I'm kind of using colloquial terms for these three different types of grasslands that we have in Southern California. I think we have grasslands that shouldn't be grasslands. We have grasslands that probably weren't grasslands. And then we have grasslands that definitely are grasslands. So grasslands that shouldn't, grasslands that weren't, and grasslands that are. So what I mean by this, because I'm sure if we were at a live audience, a couple of you would be raising your eyebrows now. So grasslands that shouldn't be grasslands. These are plant communities that used to be dominated by something else, and they're now dominated by exotic annual grasses. A great example of this is desert scrub that's been invaded quite heavily in many parts of the Mojave and the Sonoran by red brome. And it turns into a desert grassland, especially once it burns. So you get this fine continuous fuel layer that didn't used to historically be there. All of these desert shrubs will burn, and they'll die. They have a really high mortality after fire, and it quite quickly and easily converts into a desert grassland. The other example of this type of a grassland that shouldn't be is something like coastal sage scrub out in the background of this picture here. And the foreground, there's been a fire, and it gets invaded by ripgut or oats or wild barley or sometimes even red brome, and it converts into like an inland or foothills exotic grassland as well. And I do want to point out that in Southern California, this annual grass invasion into these shrublands and the conversion can happen with or without fire. It definitely happens a lot quicker with fire and with repeated fire, but even in areas that haven't burned in a long time, we can still get these shrublands converting into annual grassland. So these are kind of grasslands that shouldn't be. Next, I want to focus a little bit on grasslands that weren't. These are plant communities that were likely not grasslands, but were misclassified as historic grasslands. So oftentimes in our grasslands in Southern California, there's so little native vegetation left on these grasslands. It can be in the high 90% of exotic plant cover, that we really don't have a good idea of what used to grow there in historic times. Rich Minnick, in his book, California's Fading Wildflowers, goes through a really deep dive into this exercise. And he uses the diaries of early Spanish explorers and others to highlight numerous observations of wildflowers in the winter and spring in Southern California. And he talks about, and he goes through these examples of flower fields and pastures that are very flowery, flower-strewn prairies, fields, groves, and valleys full of flowers. And oftentimes, currently in Southern California, we just don't see those areas. But these were relatively common back in the late 1700s and early 1800s. Conversely, during the summer, when the explorers were coming through, they described dry lands. And one of their main goals was to try and introduce livestock to Southern California. And they described areas with little pasture, and they didn't describe them with green with perennial bunch grasses. So if we did have like a 20% perennial bunch grass cover in some of these areas historically, then I would expect them, and Minnick also expects them to have described them at least with some summer pasture. And they described it with, as relatively barren. And same thing during the Spanish land grant period. Again, areas were described as barren valleys, like in the example of Rancho Temecula. So these grasslands that weren't, they historically were likely not grasslands in Southern California, but were misclassified as historic grasslands by modern ecologists and botanists, partially because there's just so few native plants left in these areas. And I suspect that perennial grasses were probably not the dominant herbaceous plant type. It was probably some sort of a mixed component with wildflowers as a main component that's currently been invaded by ripgut and red brome, as well as oats and the barleys. And we kind of also classify these as inland or foothill exotic annual grasslands. So the alternative model for these areas is that they were historic grasslands and they have been invaded. So in the textbook on California grasslands, on page 3, there's a great quote: "The annualization of the California flora is reflected in California's grassland communities, many of which have been converted from perennial to annual dominance." So I'm not saying that they're wrong. I'm just saying that at least in parts of Southern California, there's at least strong historical evidence to suggest that these weren't converted from perennial to annual dominance. They probably were dominated by annuals in historic times. So they weren't grasslands in Southern California in some of these areas. They were probably more of a wildflower field with perennial, low cover of perennial grasses. And lastly, we have grasslands that are. These are the grasslands that we know exist in historical times, and they're currently existing now. And bunch grasses are a significant but often minor component in our grasslands. And just like everybody says, the big problem with our grasslands is that they're being dominated by exotic annuals. So why is this so important? Why does it matter what the history of these areas are and what happened to these sites now? So here's 2 different grasslands in Southern California. One's more coastal and one's more in the mountains, but both of them have at least 98% cover of exotic plants, and relatively little of the cover here is natives. So it's really hard to figure out what these grasslands used to be like when you have so many exotic annuals currently invading these plant communities. And just on top of that, trying to remove, 90% of the plants and trying to get something with some sort of a native flavor to it can be really, really difficult. And it's even more difficult when we have this idea of what these restoration sites should look like, and it's just not going to support the plants that we think should be growing there. I often get draft restoration plans from people in Southern California that want to try and grow something with 40, 50, sometimes even 70% perennial grass cover. And it's not a viable restoration strategy. The areas tend to be too dry to support really dense perennial grasses in some of these areas. But again, of course, it all depends on which exact area we're talking about. So kind of to throw, you know, 3 exaggerations of what the historic California flora may have looked like. You know, it could have been something that's a lot more wildflower dominated than dominated by the annual grasses that we currently see. And trying to figure out how much of a perennial grass cover we had is going to be difficult, but in some cases, we're probably overestimating how many perennial grasses we had. So getting on to more of the, you know, nuts and bolts of how do we actually manage these grasslands in Southern California? One of our first tools that we can use is fire. And when we talk about fire, we need to think about the whole fire regime, including frequency, intensity, size, pattern, season, and severity. Grasslands in Southern California, we know regularly burned during historic periods, both by natural and human causes. We know Native Americans were regularly burning patches to increase seed production, but we don't know the exact specifics of the fire regime that they were putting out on this land. We've lost that knowledge, and it really kind of sets us back on management as well. We do know that in Southern California, we do not often have enough fuels in our grasslands to burn annually. We also know that a well-timed fire can reduce non-native cover for 2 to 4 years, especially if you're burning before the annual grasses have started to produce seeds. And because it's drier down here, fire can be applied to the landscape at most 2 out of 3 years. So you'd have like a burn rest and a burn cycle. But more often we're burning once every 5 or so years, just because it's quite difficult to get a fire on the landscape. And given that the seed bank of most of our annual weeds is 2 to 3 years, some of them like black mustard are, you know, on the order of 5 years or longer, by itself, fire will not be sufficient to restore grassland or weed cover for long enough for the natives to establish. So while you can knock back some of your non-natives by correctly timing a fire, it's the fire, you can't get repeated fires long enough to reduce the seed bank of the annuals to where they will really, really plummet to levels where you can start to get your natives in there. On top of that, we have really strict air quality standards in Southern California, and this puts challenges on fires and also limits on daily fire sizes. There are exceptions, but 175 acres is one of the lines. There's also limits on our weather conditions, which, you know, happen all over the state, and they have to be conducted by somebody who actually knows what they're doing. And on top of that, we often starting in June and July, our air pollution levels usually get too high to start a prescribed fire. So most of the people who talked about prescribed fires before me were talking about June and July burns, and in most years, our air pollution's too high to actually get a June and July burn. So we're looking at April and May burns just because of that restriction. Even though I've talked about all the problems with fire, it can be a really useful restoration tool in Southern California. It's often difficult to meet our ecological objectives or match the historic fire regime under our current limitations. But it is really great as a first run vegetation management tool. It's something that can really help remove all of that litter and thatch. And so it's great as a, you know, first strategy when you're trying to restore your grasslands. And it has lots of benefits, as I mentioned some of them. So grazing in our grasslands in Southern California. Our grasslands were the earliest parts of the state to be intensively grazed during the Spanish Mission period. Even though most or many parts of Southern California are highly developed, it's really hard to imagine tens of thousands of head of cattle in Southern California. But we know we had them. We know that Irvine Ranch had 14,000 head. We know there were 3,000 head in Pomona and 5,000 in Santa Ana. And we still have quite a lot of open space in Southern California where there are options for grazing, but we only have several thousand head across all of Southern California, including the deserts. So just the historic amount of cows on the landscape was really, really high compared to what we have now. It's almost mind-bogglingly different. But we do know that grazing can reduce litter accumulation. It can decrease the cover of non-native annuals. If it's well timed, you can get an increased cover of wildflowers post-grazing. It does increase bare ground, so erosion can be an issue. And it also increases the cover of unpalatable plants, both native and non-native. So it can give you a new weed invasion if you're not being careful. One of our unique problems to Southern California is that we don't have enough livestock during the growing season to go around. So we need to graze before the non-natives are starting to flower, and we need to remove them after the grasses senesce, especially to help with erosion issues and things like that. So we need somewhere for the livestock to go during the summer and winter and fall, and we don't really have that much pasture in Southern California to do that. So often our herds tend to be rotated around, or they're relatively small herds that stay on site the whole year. And on top of that, because there are so many people who are interested in grazing, because it can be applied across, you know, dozens upon dozens of acres, there's competition between preserves for limited numbers of livestock. I've actually talked with land managers who've had sheep pulled off of their pastures and moved to a different pasture during the middle of the season, because the shepherd had a contract with another preserve and had to move the sheep off. So they were unable to meet the prescription just due to the demand placed on those sheep across the region. On top of that, our precipitation is quite variable. And so it's really difficult to get a prescribed grazing plan on the landscape for multiple years in a row. So we had good rain in 2019, horrible in 2018, good rain in 2017, and okay rain in 2016. So again, if you're looking at the past 4 years, you might only have been able to get cows or sheep or goats on the landscape 2 out of 4 years. Grazing can be very effective if managers can get the livestock. In Southern California, sheep are most often the preferred type of grazer. And it can be expensive in Southern California. Yes, you can pay to have sheep graze your landscape because you might need to haul in water, fencing, pay a shepherd, hire those sheep dogs for protection, and have the herd travel around. So it's best used infrequently. Switching over to chemicals, and Tom did a great job of kind of covering these in detail. I'm just going to kind of provide a general overview. And herbicides can be very effective at reducing non-native plant cover, and they can be used in very creative ways. So you can use herbicides to reduce your broadleaf weeds, shrubs, and some of your annual grasses while your perennial grasses are mostly affected. So that'd be using something like Milestone, or you can use its close cousin Transline, which will remove a smaller bouquet of your broadleaf weeds and some shrubs, while most of your perennial grasses are also unaffected. So these are great for restoration, rehabilitation of grasslands. Other options, like Tom mentioned, you can use grass-specific herbicides, and some of them will reduce your annual grasses, while your broadleaves and your perennial grasses, as well as your geophytes, your bulbs, are also mostly unaffected. But these do have some grazing restrictions, so please reach out to me if you think you're going to be using those in Southern California, and I can talk you through it. Or like Tom mentioned, you can use a dormant season of glyphosate to control your annuals, and your perennial grasses can be unharmed. Other options, like Tom mentioned, pre-emergent products that you could use on ungrazed pastures. You could reduce your broadleaf annuals while your annual grasses and most perennials are unaffected with something like Gallery. And if you want something more bare ground, then you're going to be switching over to something like Esplanade, where nearly all of your annuals will be controlled and most of your perennials will be uncontrolled. They'll grow as they are. And you can also do something with Dimension Gallery as well, in that type of setting where you really want, near complete annual control. So this talk all kind of boils down to setting your conservation goals and targets. You want to identify your threats to your goals. You're going to assess the multiple control techniques, several which I pointed out. You're going to develop a plan. You're going to monitor and assess your actions, and you're going to review and modify your plan. And lo and behold, you're going to have an IPM strategy, an integrated pest management strategy, where you're working in this cycle, moving around from the top, establishing your goals, working through a plan, and reevaluating as you go on. So what does that look like in Southern California? So maybe you want to restore your stipe at a more than 10% cover, and you want to get your wildflowers up to 30% cover. Your threats might be your oats and bromes and the typical annuals we have, as well as keeping an eye on erosion. Your treatment options might be prescribed fire, grazing, herbicides. Maybe you don't have enough people for hand pulling. Maybe you can mow, but maybe you don't have any good options for biocontrol of your annual grasses. So your plan might look something like you might be able to burn it in year 1, or as an alternative, if you can't get a fire, you might mow it. Then for the next year or 2, you might get sheep out on your landscape to try and graze down, because it's really hard to get 2 fires in a row in Southern California. Then at the same time, you might be doing spot treatments for some of your annual grasses and weeds, especially those ones that are unpalatable to sheep. You might be collecting native plant seed for in the years 3 and 4 of this project, and then seeding that out in year 4 and 5 and monitoring the whole site. And so it's kind of a quick way of how this talk kind of boils into a plan that you might implement. So wrapping this all up, there's several different types of grasslands in Southern California, and nearly all of them are dominated by exotic annuals, but you need to be cautious about what type of plant community you're trying to restore to in these invaded grasslands, because what you think might be a viable restoration strategy might not actually be able to be supported based on the limitations of your site. So most of our options for management in Southern California are difficult to implement. And due to these challenges, we often have to use multiple tools, because it's really difficult to get fire on the landscape multiple years, livestock on the landscape for multiple years. So your best approach is to use an IPM strategy and work adaptively and think on your toes. And with that, here's my email, and I'll take any questions if we have any, and if I have any time left. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Chris. We do have one question in the Q&A here. Is there value in seeding after a prescribed fire, or just let the native seed bank germinate?
So it depends on how high the cover of your annual grasses have been. So there's been sites in Southern California that have burned, and they've had, well over 90% exotic annual grass cover for decades. And when they've burned, they've gotten absolutely no flush of the wildflower seed bank. There weren't any wildflower seeds left in the seed bank to germinate. But in other areas where we do have more of, some of a mixed setting, where you might only have like 70% of your exotic annual grasses, but 10 to 20% wildflower cover, then yeah, you might be better off leaving it to have some of those wildflowers come up on their own. But oftentimes in Southern California, we have so many annual grasses, exotic annual grasses, that the wildflower seed bank is really, really minimal, and we do have to add wildflower seeds, which get to be really expensive really quick.
Okay, thank you, Chris. There's one more question, but in the interest of time, I'll have you answer that afterwards, and I'm going to go ahead and launch your poll.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, everyone should be able to see the poll now, so if everyone could respond, and then we'll give Chris a chance to address the results. Okay, maybe a second or two. Looks like most folks have answered. Okay, I'm going to end the poll. All right. Can everyone see? Chris, can you address the questions?
Okay, looks like everybody pretty much got the right answers here. Yeah, it's difficult to get a prescribed fire in Southern California, but it can definitely be worth it. And yeah, we definitely need to use a variety of techniques, an IPM program, to restore our grasslands in Southern California, because it's just so difficult to get these single treatments for multiple years. We often have to switch around and use multiple tools, which does take a lot of work for our land managers. And I understand that it is difficult to switch from fire to grazing to herbicides. But thanks.
All right, thank you, Chris. Okay, we have one more speaker, Scott Oneto. Scott is a farm advisor in UCCE Central Sierra, El Dorado, Almodora, Calaveras, and Tuolumne counties, which I think I just mispronounced all of them. Scott, are you able to share your screen?
I think so. Is that show up on your end, Whitney?
Yes, great, thank you.
And I don't know if you have my video feed. Do you want that on or off?
Oh, it's up to you.
I tried sharing it, but it says the host has it blocked. So I'll leave it as it is. That works. There we go. All right, should be on. Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Whitney, for getting us all organized and putting this program together. I also want to give a quick shout out to Gail Perez, who many of you probably know just from registering. But Gail runs our Weed Research and Information Center at UC Davis and is really the person behind the scenes that gets these programs up and going and just provides tons of educational opportunity to our clientele statewide. So thanks again, Gail, for all your support. I'm going to be covering managing invasive grasses on annual rangelands, and I'm going to be trying to cover basically the areas between what Chris just described in Southern California, and then Tom did an amazing job covering the northeast part of the state. So I'm going to work on all of that stuff in between. And so this is basically what we're referring to. This is the annual grasslands of the central part of California. And it kind of all depends on the goals, but I kind of think of this as a plethora of diversity, which is often the desired outcome, whether you're a rancher or if you're a wildlife preserve or whatever the case may be. We're often trying to have a mix of species. Often that is a mix of non-native annual grasses, non-native annual forbs, but it's also often very lucky to have a mix of perennial native grasses and also perennial or native forbs and wildflowers as well. And so that's kind of often what the desired outcome is, depending on wherever you're coming from. But there's a couple of different species that have been mentioned today that often kind of throw a hitch into having that diversity, and that's these two species here, Medusa head and barb goatgrass. And those are the two that I'm going to primarily focus on today. So these two species are also non-native annual grasses. They were introduced from basically the Mediterranean region, came to California and the western states in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and today they are covering millions of acres here in California and across the western states. And to a bigger extent, they're spreading at a pretty alarming rate, especially barb goatgrass in my part of the state, which I'm basically in the Sierra Nevada region from El Dorado County down through Tuolumne County, so just east of Sacramento in the Central Valley. So in terms of their impacts, and the reason I'm focused on these two species today is, a colleague of mine, Guy Kaiser, who's a lead scientist at UC Davis, used this term transformer species. And I don't know if he thought of this word, but it really just does a great job for describing what these two species do here in California in annual rangelands. And basically these two species they just create monocultures. They're very, very competitive, and they are really good at outcompeting all of the other plants. And so some of the other impacts of these two species is that they've been mentioned before, but these are often thought of as unpalatable species. So whether it be livestock or native ungulates, most animals will often avoid these plants if they have other more desirable species to graze on. And some research that's been done in prior years by colleagues have shown that grazing capacity can often be reduced by as much as 80% when you have either of these species. As been shown in previous talks, that these plants have these nasty awns, and that's one of the reasons why animals have a tendency to browse or graze around them. Medusa head often starts forming very high levels of silica as it gets into its later stages of development, also being very unpalatable. So that's another reason why animals have a tendency to stay away from it. And that high silica makes those plants break down at a very, very slow rate. And so that slow decay will often result in these very, very thick thatch layers. And you can see thatch as high as, I've seen it as 3 to 5 inches in places, where you just get this unbelievable thick thatch buildup. And you would think that that would prevent the germination from any plants, but Medusa head in general has this very adapted ability to even germinate through its own thatch. And so it creates this microenvironment that promotes its further spread in these very thatchy systems. And so this is what that looks like across the landscape. So this is that very thick thatch of Medusa head. And so again, you can see why it could be a problem for other annuals or perennials to try to germinate underneath that. But again, Medusa head with that long on is able to penetrate down through that thatch and still germinate and grow. Just a little quick about the biology. This has been covered pretty good by some of the other speakers, but these are winter annuals, so they germinate with the first fall rains. Hopefully all of you are getting some of those first fall rains over the last 24 hours like we are here. And that germination period can extend into the spring. What's unique about these two species is they have a tendency to focus a lot of their initial growth into root development. And by doing that, they, again, have a more competitive advantage than some of the other annuals, but that also allows them to mature a little bit later than some of those other desirable annual grasses. And so what we often see is that, as we get into late spring and into summer, our grasslands of California begin to turn brown. And as you see here, again, mix of, in this picture, of wild oats, and we have ryegrass and some different bromes. But you can see as those annual grasses are turning brown, there's still some green players here in the picture. And these later maturing species often tend to be Medusa head and goat grass. So this is a picture of Medusa head just a little bit closer up. It can often be, again, misidentified because, it often looks like many of the other species that we have in our annual rangelands, like foxtail and others. And so one of the things that is very characteristic are these awns. And so very, very long awns. And unlike many other annual grasses that have long awns, as the seeds drop, you see that the seed head, or the inflorescence or the flowering head, doesn't disarticulate like many of the other plants, meaning it stays all intact like this. So in that thatch layer, if you're unfamiliar with Medusa head, go out and look in right now. There's a great time, and look to see if you have any of these seed head or these flower heads that are intact like this. And that's a really good indicator of Medusa head. And then here is goat grass. This is a barb goat grass. There's a couple of different species of goat grass in California. All of them are bad, but this is just the worst one, at least in terms of the number of acres, and the rate of spread seems to be worse with this one. So this is barb goat grass. Again, very, very long awns. Gets its name from sort of the shape of the inflorescence or the flower. You can see where the seeds are here, where the seeds attach, kind of looks like an outline of a goat's head, and so that's where it gets the name goat grass. Unlike the Medusa head and many other grasses, when the seeds drop out, goat grass is very different. And so the actual whole inflorescence, that whole seed structure, the whole flower structure, basically breaks off at the top of the stem. And so you get these whole entire flower heads that just drop down to the ground. And so it's just this group of basically seeds that fall to the ground. And so again, in the fall, this time of the year, if you go out and look in your pastures, you might see these whole entire seed heads laying on the ground. And this is a picture I took of a rancher that I was working with that had a lot of goat grass. And, we were trying to figure out exactly how it was getting spread from, field to field. And just a quick look underneath his ATV showed this. And so, this is just one of the many ways in which we're spreading these weeds around. So before I get into the control strategies, I think it's important to point out, maybe think about why these plants are invading. And I already alluded to the ability of these plants to be highly competitive, both for nutrients, for soil moisture, but they also, again, create that environment in which they're excluding other plants from even germinating. And so that's one of the reasons why, thatch control is so important especially for Medusa head control, is, to try to just get rid of that, that exposure, that buildup of material that's preventing other plants from germinating. The other thing that I think is really important that we need to think about is, many of these rangelands across the state are used for livestock grazing. And if you think about how our systems are set up, we often have very, very large pastures with low grazing pressure. And because these plants are non-palatable, that basically allows the animals to graze for the highest and most delicious food. And so, they are grazing around these invasive plants and basically selecting for these plants. So, they're eating all of the desirable stuff, allowing both the Medusa head and goat grass to basically flower and make new seed. And so we're actually propagating and selecting these plants just by the sheer fact of what our current grazing systems often are set up as. Low grazing pressure, and animals can go around and just choose the most nutritious and often the best tasting plants in the pastures. And then also the timing is something we need to think about. So again, these are later maturing species, and in many areas, it could be, so again, as the more desirable grasses have been fed down, they start turning brown, the nutrient value of those start dropping off very quickly. It's not uncommon for many livestock producers to then pull those animals off just as these two species are starting to flower and mature. They'll pull their animals off and either ship them to irrigated pasture, or they may have allotments up in the U.S. Forest Service where they then take their animals up into the mountains for summer grazing. And so, again, kind of selectively selecting for these two species by just pulling the animals off just at the time when grazing would be so important for trying to prevent those plants from going to seed. So a lot of these control strategies have been mentioned by some of the other previous speakers, and so I'll just hit on some of them and maybe focus on some of the parts that haven't been talked about. And so, when it comes to controlling and managing these annuals, of course, as been stated, we want to prevent seed production. And then we want to work on that seed bank. And so, luckily we've got fairly short-lived seeds that we're dealing with. Medusa head, it pretty much requires annual seed development for it to persist. It has a very, very short-lived seed in the soil. Often 1 year, sometimes 2 years, maybe you'll get a few more that last longer than that, but it really does require annual seed production to persist. Barb, the goat grass, is a little bit longer. It's got a bigger seed, and so it can persist 2 to 3 years, and sometimes even longer than that. But usually breaking that cycle for 2 to 3 years can give you pretty good control. And then we want to do some monitoring, as was mentioned by Chris and other speakers, and then really focusing on small satellite populations at first, and then trying to attack some of those larger populations. So because our focus today is on burning, I wanted to start some of the control strategies with burning. This is a VMP, a vegetation management program burn conducted by CAL FIRE that I was a part of this summer that was focused on yellow star thistle and also for Medusa head And so, so this was a fairly large burn. Again, the timing, as Devii pointed out, is super critical. You want to do it just as those desirable annuals have set seed and drop those seeds to the soil surface, and then you use that brown material as the fuel source to carry that fire through these later maturing species. So, you know, yellow star thistle, medusa head, goatgrass, all of these 3 species have a tendency to mature later than all of the other desirable forage species. And so we can use that timing as to be able to do a selective treatment. So when it comes to burning, you know, I kind of see 2 different windows. The first being the one that was just shown and the one that was described by Devii and others about, you know, kind of this late spring, early summer burn, where we're timing the burn before our weeds have fully flowered and made seed, but after all of the desirables have flowered and set seed, and using them as the fuel source. So usually this is, you know, depends on the part of the state, but could be anywhere from, you know, late April into June, and sometimes even into July. Kind of all just depends on, you know, what part of the state and the year and how those plants are maturing. Of course, you need adequate fuel to carry that fire. If you don't have, I mean, if you have nothing but a full stand of medusa head or goatgrass or yellow star thistle, and you don't have any brown material or thatch to carry that fire, you're going to get a very patchy burn and really get poor control that year. If the fire is too late, which sometimes I see, you're really, you know, you're not doing much for preventing seed production for that year. Often those seeds, you know, if you're doing a burn in August or September, or, you know, you look at some of the wildfires that we have that have tendency to be later in the season, the seeds have already been set, right? So you already had seed production, they dropped to the ground. So sure, you might be getting rid of some of just the vegetation and you know, releasing some of those nutrients that, again, might promote the germination, like Devii pointed out, which could be a good thing. But then you just want to make sure you can come in and do a follow-up treatment. Another part of burning that I am kind of interested in, and I think there might be some folks on today that are from East Bay Municipal Utility District, but this is something that they I saw them do a number of years ago, and there's really not a whole lot of research in this sort of timing window yet, but I'm very intrigued about wanting to pursue this more. And this is what I call a late fall or early winter burn. And this is targeted at some of these annuals like medusa head and goatgrass that can have a tendency to germinate right away with the first fall rains. And if you have tons of thatch, you know, think of that 4 inches of thatch of medusa head, and underneath that thatch, after the first fall rain, you start getting the germination of medusa head. If we have the perfect opportunity, you know, if we get a dry spell like in November, maybe in December, you know, where we have maybe a week or 2 of dry weather, that thatch dries out, and you have those newly germinated plants down there, that might be an opportunity to run a very, you know, low-risk fire through that thatch. And it doesn't need to be a very hot fire because we're just trying to kill little 2-3 inch newly germinated plants. And so again, not really any research to be able to point to at this point, but it's something that I'm kind of interested in looking at a bit more. In terms of burning considerations, I think a lot of this has already been alluded to by the earlier speakers, so I won't really spend too much time on this slide. But really, you know, following up after a burn is really, really important. Sometimes reseeding, again, depending on what your goals are, depending on what the seed bank is, what that seed bank is consisting of, and, you know, what kind of a strategy you might want to come in with after a burn. Sometimes it can be extremely difficult to do a burn 2 years in a row because, again, we need some type of material, whether it be thatch or you know, dead desirable forage grasses to carry that fire. And, you know, if you have nothing but, say, yellow star thistle, you do a burn, you know, often, as Devii said, you get a lot of germination of yellow star thistle the second year. And if that's all you have is yellow star thistle, it'd be tough to run a burn through that patch in year 2. So often doing some other control strategy might be needed. A couple of other control strategies I just want to throw out there for consideration. Mowing can be effective. This is kind of more, I would consider, a smaller scale strategy. You know, if you have small patches or just a small pasture where you see medusa head or goat grass starting to come in. Again, goal is to prevent seed production. So we want to time this just as those plants are starting to get into early flowering. You know, this is late in the season, lots of brown grass out there, high risk for starting fires with mowing equipment. You have to be super careful. You know, I've started a fire from, you know, mowing for weed control this time in this sort of situation. So you just have to be super, super careful and know your environment, know what's out there, and use the right piece of equipment. Again, mowing super low, so you want to try to get that grass down as low as you can, 1 to 2 inches. And you're doing it as late as possible because you want to have that plant as stressed as, you know, as drought stressed as possible, so it doesn't have the resources to be able to regrow. If you mow too early, you're pretty much just shooting yourself in the foot. The plants are going to recover. If you mow too late, the seeds have already been produced. And as I mentioned, beware of fire. There are some great success stories out there. Both state parks in Nevada County has done some really interesting work with mowing. And also this picture is from Creekside Center for Earth Observation that has done some interesting work. This is kind of what that environment looks like just before a burn. So you can see all the desirables have headed out, dropped their seeds, and medusa head in this case is just starting to get into early flowering. Grazing also, it can be an effective tool. This is some work that was done by a colleague, Morgan Duran, several years ago, looking at sheep grazing on medusa head. And he basically did 3 different timings: early spring, a combination of early and late spring, and just late spring. And so, as you can see here, this is a graph showing medusa head cover, and the late spring by itself was by far the best at, again, preventing medusa head from being able to regrow that year and make seed. So grazing can certainly be an effective strategy. You want to do high intensity, short duration grazing, and you want to, again, have lots and lots of animal units per acre. And that's just one of the reasons why we, you know, see so much medusa head and goat grass, is we often just can't get that high intensity grazing unless you're doing it as a prescription and breaking those pastures up into smaller scale. The picture at the bottom here just shows some supplement tubs that can be used in patches of medusa head or bark goat grass to try to increase utilization around certain areas. So that certainly can also be an option as well. So just a few things on chemicals. This has already been covered a little bit by some of the other speakers. This is a ranch that I was working on a few years ago that had nothing but barbed goat grass. And so this was just after treatment. They everything green here is barbed goat grass that they missed, but they basically treated barbed goat grass with glyphosate as a post-emergent just during the flowering stage. So all, you know, if there was anything desirable out there, it already would have set seed and died. And so glyphosate can be used as a selective treatment when you use it late in the season. Aminopyrrolid, which is a milestone, can be used for medusa head control. This is some work that Guy Kaiser did. So the plot on the right is some Italian ryegrass that came in just spontaneously after milestone treatment, and then on the left here you can see nothing but medusa head. So we've got some really good handouts that have the prescriptions and what the rates of some of these. Aminocyclopyrochlor is the last herbicide I'll mention. This is another broadleaf herbicide that can be used for, again, some of these grasses. And so it can be effective for medusa head, both as a pre-emergent as well as a post-emergent application, either fall or spring. And then for barbed goat grass, it also has been effective. And Guy Kaiser, again, did some really good work showing that 4 ounces of aminocyclopyrochlor as a single treatment, either applying it pre-emergently in the fall or in the winter or even in the spring, can be effective at reducing barbed goat grass, but he got the best results when he actually split that 4-ounce treatment into 2 ounces in the fall and 2 ounces in the winter. He got amazing control. So there are some effective tools for management of both of these species. Got to think about timing and definitely monitoring, and then definitely look out for new populations. So with that, there's lots of great resources out there. These slides will be made available to folks, and so you can refer back to any of the slides or the publications that are mentioned here. So thank you so much, and I'll take any questions if there's time, Whitney.
Thank you, Scott. We do have a bit of time. We've got one question, and then I'll go ahead and launch the poll. So first question is, Scott, can you discuss the use of remote sensing in detecting these species and how it might be used in early detection?
Oh my gosh, I love that question. Yeah, so I think there is lots and lots of potential there. I actually just got a drone myself. This is a project that I'm going to be working on, hopefully starting this next year, looking at using drones for detecting incipient or small weed populations. And so the tools are already out there. It's just a matter of figuring out the signature for some of these weeds, especially these things that have unique phenologies where they mature super late. Maybe they've got bright yellow flowers when nothing else is flowering. All of those kinds of things we can use for remote sensing. So, even if you don't have a drone, we can use the amazing satellite imagery that's available to hopefully detect some of these weeds. So, I think with technology, we're going to be able to use so much more here in the coming years to use it as a tool for weed control.
Okay. So we'll go ahead and launch the poll, and then there's a couple other questions that we'll answer maybe after we do the poll. Okay, so we're going to launch it. Okay, everyone should be able to see and vote. Okay, a couple more seconds here, and then we'll let Scott adjust the answers. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. Okay, Scott, if you want to take a look here at people's responses.
Great. So question number 1, grazing can be effective at controlling medusa head when done at the right time and intensity. Looks like everybody's spot on. That is true. Number 2, what method or methods can be used as effective at controlling medusa head and bark goat grass? And we had, looks like everybody chose, pretty much everybody said both grazing livestock with high intensity and burning to prevent medusa head and bark goat grass from setting seed. That was perfect. And number 3, aminopyrrolid, a broadleaf herbicide, can be used to control medusa head. True or false? And that is true. It can be used both pre-emergent in the fall before germination at high rates, typically between 12 and 14 ounces per acre, or you can use it as a post-emergent product. So just as medusa head is beginning to flower, you can actually use very low rates between 3 and 5 ounces per acre, and it doesn't kill the plant, but it does cause seed sterility. So the plants basically produce infertile seeds. So that is true. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we've got, I think if the speakers are willing to stick around for a few moments to answer some questions, we can answer questions. Please put them in the Q&A, and then speakers, if you can address them live, that would be great. I'm going to go ahead and share the instructions for after for your credits as well. So if you're getting CCU credits or CCA credits, there's the code for the QR code. And that will also be sent out via email afterwards. Oops. And thank you all for attending, and we're here for a few more minutes if anyone would like to pose any questions. Scott, did you answer the question already in the chat, it looks like? Or
yes. So okay. Joy, if you're still on, I think I brought my slide back up, so hopefully you saw it. And yeah, if you're interested in, and same with Tristan, if you're interested in more information on remote sensing, if you want to reach out to me offline by email, my email address, I'll put it here in the chat. And just feel free to reach out to me, and I can send you some more information on what I know, although it's very limited at the moment. It's something that I'm interested in and wanting to learn more. So definitely look forward to chatting more.
Okay, well, if no one has any more questions, we will let everyone go, but we'll stick around for a few minutes for any additional questions. So thank you, everyone. Thank you very much for attending today. We appreciate everyone's patience with us for some of the technical difficulties, and we'll hopefully see you again. Thank you. Okay, I'm not sure if Devi's here again, but there's a question about being able to hire a burn boss. Can you recommend how to find a burn boss to hire? Maybe if anyone else is able to answer that question. I think Devi's not still here. Any of our other speakers know the answer to that? How do you find a burn boss?
Yeah, I think, so this is Scott. So I think they, I want to say that they register possibly with CAL FIRE. And I'm sorry, I'm kind of shooting from the hip here. But I guess maybe the best thing to do would be to reach out to some of our fire advisors in the state. So if you send an email to Lenya or possibly Jeffrey Stackhouse, or here in my part of the state, Susie Coker is our forester, and I know she does. She's doing a lot with prescribed fire, and she does a lot with burn bosses on her projects. And so if you need me to get you in contact with any of them, reach out to me offline, and I can send you their email and contact information.
Thank you, Scott. And we've got one question about will we be able to see the questions and answers later? And I think Gail and I could make that happen. So yes. Another question, a little new to this. Every time I have talked about prescribed burning in general, a lot of people mention it's not possible in California, but seen in this presentation, it's being used all over the state. Is it just due to costs, permits, different restrictions? So any panelist.
I can take it if nobody else will. I think it's really varied, and it's varied depending on air quality, right? If you can get the permit, and depending on what the other fires in your area are at the moment and things like that. And then a lot of the burns that I know folks are using are training burns for either local firefighters or CAL FIRE. And so it depends on, right, certain years when they all get called to right, an actual fire, you lose your burn crew. So it's not an easy thing to do reliably, right? But it certainly happens often, but you have to kind of hope for the right conditions for it to happen.
I'll add that I put in a response to one of the earlier questions that there is a growing resource, and I'll put it in the chat as well, that's calpba.org, and it can help you connect with local people who are working to do more prescribed burns. And there are more and more kind of every month across the state. So it's really exciting to see it spreading.
Yeah, I guess I would just echo that there are lots and lots of these prescribed burn associations starting to get formed throughout the state, and you know, it's really just going to be kind of dependent on the area, but you know, it seems like there's lots of interest by landowners and land managers to bring burning back as a tool, because we've kind of shunned away from it for so long. But now I think a lot of people are seeing that burning needs to be reintroduced as a tool for land management.
So I'll add that in Southern California, like I talked about, it's difficult to get prescribed fire on the landscape, partly due because of air quality restrictions and pollution. So while it is possible, there's often just a really small window to get it done. And oftentimes we are lacking in people, in basically foresters who have that burn experience. A lot of them are employed in the northern parts of the state. So we just don't have as much like literal people to help with fires. But it does happen. There are land managers who do burn regularly in Southern California, and there are prescribed fires. They just tend to be small, and they tend to be, you know, every couple of years or so. So it does happen. It just does often take in Southern California, I think, more work than in other parts of the state to get over those humps of limited people and air quality restrictions.
Okay, well, I don't see any more questions in the Q&A, so we'll let everybody go. I want to say thank you again to all of our speakers, and thank you to everyone that attended, and thank you to Gail and the Weed Rec again for organizing this. So thank you. We'll hopefully see you all again.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks.